Moana. I was still utterly shocked that Edric wanted to take me out shopping so soon after the tabloid incident, but the next morning he was waiting for me in the living room when I came out of my room. He was dressed well, although much more casually than normal, in a white polo shirt and trousers. He had a mask and a pair of sunglasses in his hand, and I realized that he would be mostly unrecognizable dressed like this in public with his face covered. As I walked up to him, however, I noticed that he had a second mask in his hand. He held it out to me. "You'll have to wear this," he said. "Now that people have seen your face, you'll have to be more cautious in public." Admittedly, I felt a little bit hurt that we still had to be so secretive, but I finally understood where he was coming from and took the mask without fuss. As we walked over to the foyer, I also made sure to grab my sun hat along with my purse. The hat would cover my easily recognizable hair, at least a little bit. Edric seemed pleased with this decision, and we put our disguises on before we even stepped out of the elevator in the lobby. With his mask and sunglasses on and dressed so casually, he really did look like a completely different person. Edric drove us to a shopping mall that I had never been to, a different one from before. This one wasn't an outdoor strip mall like the one that he took me to for baby supplies, but was rather a large indoor mall. As we stepped through the big glass doors, I felt awed by the massive fountains, lush greenery, and big glass ceilings. All of the other people walking around seemed to be wealthy. Even the groups of teenagers strutting around were dressed impeccably well in designer clothing, and I felt rather out of place in my simple dress and sandals. Edric and I walked around for a bit before stopping at a children's clothing store first. The prices were expensive, so I only picked out a few things: a simple cotton dress, a light sweater since summer would be coming to an end soon, and a few little onesies for the baby. Edric was mostly quiet the entire time, occasionally wandering off to look at some things on his own before returning to me. When I was finished, I approached the counter and dug into my purse for my wallet. "I'll pay," Edric said, pulling his wallet out of his pocket and extracting his black credit card from one of the slots. I shook my head vehemently and put my hand up to stop him, ignoring the cashier's confused glances as she rang up my things and folded them neatly. "It's all right," I insisted. "I want to pay myself." Edric frowned, but didn't say anything else until we walked out of the store. "Why wouldn't you let me pay?" he asked. I shrugged. "I want to purchase some things for our baby as well," I replied. "It doesn't feel right letting you pay for everything." "It's all the same, isn't it?" he asked. "I do pay your salary, after all." At Edric's words, I felt my face get a little hot. Every so often, I was reminded that he did indeed pay my salary. It was a little embarrassing being paid by the father of my child, but I didn't say anything. Edric didn't bring it up again, either. Next, we went into a high-end women's clothing store. The prices here were even more exorbitant than the first store, and as I looked at the price tags, I immediately felt out of place. Even the sales associates gave me some odd looks. I didn't even want to touch the clothes for fear of getting them dirty or damaging them and having to pay for them. "Good afternoon," one of the sales associates said with a warm smile. "Can I help you find anything today?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Edric chimed in. "Yes," he said. "She needs a nice dress for an event. Something a bit loose and fit for a pregnant woman, but nice nonetheless." The saleswoman's smile widened. "Oh, congratulations," she said, glancing at my belly. "I think I know of a few styles that will look lovely on you. If you'd like to go and wait by the fitting rooms and take a seat, I'll bring them to you. Let me just take some measurements first." She grabbed the measuring tape from around her neck and took measurements around my bust, my belly, and the length from my shoulder to my ankles before directing us over to the fitting rooms. I felt even more out of place now. I had never been to any store that took measurements for clothes. Edric and I waited quietly by the fitting rooms while the saleswoman ran around and gathered several dresses. As she approached, I could already tell that they were all of the highest quality, and I knew I wouldn't be able to afford any of them. Before I could protest, however, the saleswoman showed me to a fitting room. "Let me know if you need any assistance," she said with a smile. I nodded, then glanced over at Edric, who was standing nearby with his arms folded across his chest. "I'd like to see them all as you try them on," he said, momentarily moving to run a hand through his hair. Even through his mask, he seemed a little uncomfortable at the prospect of watching me try on clothes, but I agreed to his request nonetheless. The first dress I tried on was already beautiful. I stepped out of the fitting room to show Edric, who silently nodded and asked me to show him the next one. This went on for a while as I continued to try the increasingly luxurious and expensive dresses on, until I eventually came to the last dress. It was similar to the simple black dress I wore at the bar on the night we met. The material was a high-quality silk, smooth and heavy, and cool to the touch. It hugged my curves in all of the right places, but the silhouette was just right around my waist, so it didn't emphasize my pregnant belly too much. I felt a gasp catch in my throat as I looked in the mirror and noticed how the skirt flowed when I moved and how the sage green color of the dress enhanced the glow of my pregnancy. But then I saw the price tag and felt my stomach drop. It was over $1,000. "Everything all right in there?" Edric called through the door. Yeah," I said, clearing my throat. I sheepishly opened the door and stepped out. I couldn't see Edric's facial expression beneath his mask, but I swore that his eyes widened for a split second when he saw me. Without a word, he raised his finger and gestured with it in a circle to indicate for me to spin. As I did, I felt my face getting hot and was glad that I had a mask on to hide it. When I was finished, he nodded quietly. "You like that one?" he asked. I nodded, but knew I couldn't afford it. "Yes, but it's very expensive," I muttered. "I can't afford it. I think we should try another store." Edric shook his head suddenly. "Absolutely not. Consider these dresses as workwear provided by your employer." My eyes widened. "No," I insisted. "You don't have to do that." "Really?" The alpha billionaire merely shrugged. "Nonsense." Before I could protest, he waved the saleswoman over, who scurried over with an even wider smile on her face. "We'll take all of the dresses she just tried on," Edric said nonchalantly. My face went pale with shock. He was going to buy me not just this dress, but all of them? "Moana, we'll take all of the dresses that she just tried on." My eyes went wide and my face went pale. I knew that Edric would insist on purchasing something for me today. Everything. I tried to protest, but he wouldn't hear it. As I sheepishly walked back into the fitting room and took the expensive dress off, my heart was pounding. Once I was dressed again, I came out and handed the dresses to the grinning saleswoman, who was likely more excited to get a large commission for this purchase than anything else. I still felt utterly shocked as we made our way over to the counter and Edric paid without batting an eye. I didn't know how I would make this up to him, but I knew that I would have to figure something out. "I don't know how to thank you," I said quietly, as we walked out of the store. "How can I make it up to you?" Edric stopped and turned to face me. Even through his mask, I could tell that he was frowning. "You're carrying my baby," he replied matter-of-factly. "I'm the one who's making it up to you." I didn't know what to say. Edric's sudden, kind words sent a shock through my body. What happened to the cold, unfeeling alpha CEO I had met just a couple of months ago? Suddenly, however, Edric's eyes narrowed a bit as he studied my face intently. "You look a little pale," he said. "Are you okay?" I hadn't realized it before, but trying on so many dresses took a lot of energy out of me, and I hadn't eaten in a while. I'm a bit hungry," I admitted, realizing now just how faint I felt. Without a word, Edric nodded and hooked his arm through mine, another unexpected display of affection that I wasn't prepared for. But before I could think about it too much, he began to guide me toward the food court. "There's a place here with excellent sandwiches," he said. "We'll get something to eat there." Thanks," I stuttered as I followed him. Time and time again today, I was shocked by Edric's kind and generous attitude so soon after the tabloid incident that was, in my eyes, entirely my fault. Even as we walked, I could feel some other shoppers' eyes on us as they noticed the werewolf human couple with masks on walking around, but it didn't seem to faze Edric in the slightest. He seemed so nonchalant that I was frankly confused as to why he didn't appear to be very worried about someone looking too closely and recognizing us. Had he made some sort of deal with the tabloid CEO to not post photos of us anymore? It was a possibility, but there were other tabloids that could easily post our pictures, and I was shocked that he didn't seem to care. It was almost as though the entire experience changed something in him. When we arrived at the food court, there were a plethora of restaurants to choose from. Edric gave me a chance to take a look at the other food being offered, but I began to feel a little sick from the smell, so he guided me over to a bench a little ways away. "You can wait here," he said, setting our shopping bags down beside me as I sat. "I'll get us some sandwiches. I'll be right back." I nodded, and before I could say anything else, he quickly jogged off to the food court. I glanced over my shoulder to watch him as he went. In his white polo shirt, I could see his bicep muscles straining against the short sleeves. I also couldn't help but notice some other young women ogling him, and I quickly looked away before I let myself get too jealous. As I waited, I took that time to close my eyes and take some deep breaths. Not even a few minutes passed, however, before I felt someone sit down next to me. I opened my eyes, expecting to see Edric, but felt a knot form in my stomach as I saw that it was a different man. He smelled like alcohol, and he was staring right at me. I leaned away, forcing a weak smile behind my mask. Hello," I said, scooting a little further away on the bench. The man only grinned and scooted closer to me. "What's a pretty thing like you doing hiding your face?" he asked. As he spoke, the smell of alcohol only became stronger as his breath wafted over to me. It almost made me gag. Before I could even answer, he spoke again. "Take your mask off? I want to see how you look." "No, thank you," I said. I stood then and grabbed my shopping bags. "Have a nice day." The man's face darkened. I turned to walk over to the food court, but I suddenly felt his hand grip my wrist so tightly it burned, and it wouldn't loosen even as I tried to wrench my arm away. "Don't be so coy," he said with a sinister smirk as his eyes traveled down my body. "I don't normally go for humans, but you're too beautiful." "Thank you, but I'm not interested," I said. I tried again to wrench my arm away, but his grip only tightened. By now, I began to panic and let out a small cry of pain. I glanced over at the food court, but I could only see a sliver of Edric's form as he spoke to the food vendor. My heart raced. I needed him to come back faster, but I couldn't call his name for fear of our identities being revealed. "You know," the man said, pulling me so hard I fell back down to a seated position on the bench and causing tears to well up in my eyes. "A lowly human such as yourself should be grateful that a wealthy werewolf like me is even remotely interested in you. Come on, sweetheart. Spend the night with me, and I'll buy you anything you want." I don't want to spend the night with you," I insisted, my voice shaking as tears began to stream down my cheeks and soak my mask. The man only grinned even wider. "Let's see what you're hiding behind that mask, anyway." He reached out then with his free hand to pull my mask down, still gripping my wrist tightly. Before he could, however, Edric's voice boomed from beside me. "What are you doing to her?" Edric snarled, storming up to the man. Instantly, I felt my fear turn into relief. As I looked up at Edric, I saw that his icy gray eyes were now glowing a silvery color, which I had never seen them do before. The man chuckled. "Leave us alone," he said, waving his hand at Edric dismissively. "She's already been spoken for." Suddenly, Edric's hand shot out. He grabbed a fistful of the man's shirt and lifted him off the bench, causing the man to release his grip on my wrist as he scrambled nervously. Edric's eyes narrowed as he brought his face just inches away from the man's face. "Get the hell out of here before I call the cops," Edric growled. He released the man's shirt, and the man quickly scurried away without another word. Edric watched after him for several moments before sitting down beside me and grabbing my wrist. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, inspecting my reddened wrist. "I'm all right," I said quietly, wiping my tears away with my free hand. Edric sighed. He turned toward me, almost as though he was about to hug me as his gray eyes softened. But then, he only looked away quickly and handed me my sandwich. Without another word, he turned forward and draped his arm across my shoulders protectively as he glanced in the direction that the creepy man took off to. I felt my body relax beneath his touch, but my heart continued to race as I felt him rubbing my upper arm comfortingly. "Go ahead and eat," he said gently. "Everything is okay now?" Moana. We returned to the penthouse after the incident with the creepy man, which unfortunately put a bit of a damper on the trip. However, I tried not to let the man get to me, and was instead grateful for Edric's quick thinking and protective demeanor. The entire ride home, I kept glancing at him by accident. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but if he did, he didn't say anything about it. After parking the car, we took the elevator up to the penthouse and finally took our masks off once we were on the elevator. I was relieved to finally take the mask off after wearing it all day and let out a deep sigh as we set down our things. Unfortunately, it seemed that our relief was short-lived. Selena quickly came into the foyer not long after we arrived with an expression on her face that was a combination of both concern and mild frustration. "What's wrong?" I asked before she even said anything. Already, just from the look on her face, I could tell that something happened. She sighed. "It's Ella," she said. "She's been moping in her room all day. I tried going in, but she even barricaded the door with toys. I'm not sure what to do." Edric and I exchanged quick glances. We both seemed to be thinking the same thing. "We'll check on her," he said with a sigh. "Go and take the rest of the night to yourself, Selena. I'm sure you're exhausted." Selena managed a weak but surprised smile. Without another word, Edric walked off in the direction of Ella's room. Selena shot me a brief glance that conveyed her shock at the alpha billionaire's suddenly generous demeanor, to which I merely shrugged before I followed him to Ella's bedroom door. Edric knocked gently on the door. "Princess?" he called out. "It's Daddy. Can you let me in, please?" "No." A tiny voice yelled from the other side of the door. "Go away! No monsters are allowed in my kingdom." Edric turned to look at me with a confused expression on his face. I contained a smirk and brushed past him. "Your Majesty," I called out, playing into her game. "Please let us in. We've been sent from another kingdom to make peace." There was a silence, followed by the sound of bare feet slapping on the floor. The door then cracked open, and one of Ella's eyes peered out. She looked both of us up and down before opening the door a little more and stepping out of the way, revealing that her room was a complete mess. She was wearing a princess costume and a tiara from her costume chest, and had arranged all of her pillows and sheets into a makeshift castle on her bed. All of her toys were scattered around the room, arranged in various scenes: a battlefield, a tea party, and a throne room. And her clothes had all been ripped out of her closet and were tossed carelessly on every surface. "Ella," Edric said, sounding disappointed, "why did you do this?" A small growl escaped Ella's lips. I looked down to see her glaring at her father through her eyebrows. Her pointed wolf ears were showing, and her tiny fangs were protruding slightly. Her claws were extended as well, and I sighed, knowing that Edric's accusatory demeanor was aggravating her further. What King Edric meant to say was that he only wants to know what happened here in your kingdom, I said gently, crouching to the little girl's level. As I did, her face softened slightly, but she still looked rather angry. "I have decided to move my kingdom elsewhere," Ella said. She pointed over to her closet, where a suitcase laid open on the floor. It was full of toys and other costumes. "This land is no longer fit for the princess." I looked up at Edric then, who had a deep frown on his face. He seemed to be at a loss for words and opened his mouth to say something, then shut it again. When he looked at me, I could see a sense of pleading behind his eyes. "Maybe the king and the princess should have a royal meeting," I suggested, urging him to play along with Ella. I knew from years of experience with children that playing along was sometimes the best way to handle a situation like this. Edric sighed, then cleared his throat nervously. Ahem, Princess Ella," he said, dropping to one knee and bowing. "Would you, be so kind as to explain why you'd like to leave this land?" Ella was silent for a moment. She tilted her chin up and stared angrily down her nose at Edric, causing her tiara to flop backwards a bit on her head. I gently reached out and straightened it for her. "I'm the only princess in the land," she said finally. "I don't want to be replaced." Edric's head snapped up. He looked at me with wide eyes and opened his mouth to say something, but I merely shook my head and nodded my head toward her, indicating for him to address his daughter and not me. He slowly looked back at Ella and cleared his throat again. "Why do you think that you'll be replaced, Princess?" he asked. Ella shrugged. You guys went out all day without me and had lots of fun. If you're already forgetting about me now, you're just going to replace me with the new baby." Now I felt my own eyes widen. Edric's face softened, and he sat down on the floor, crossing his legs. "Sweetheart, no one's going to replace you," he said gently. It was endearing to see him look at his daughter with such a genuine, pained expression. He slowly opened his arms, and after a moment of hesitation, Ella walked over to him and plopped down in his lap, burying her face in her chest. As she did, her tiara fell off of her head and clattered to the floor. "You're always going to be my first baby," Edric said softly. "You don't have to worry." They held each other like that for a few minutes. Edric rocked Ella back and forth while she sniffled, and for that time I almost felt as though I wasn't even there. I was just an observer, watching a sweet moment between a father and a daughter, and I stood, deciding to give them some space. As I walked quietly over to the door, I heard Edric speak again. "How can I make it up to you, Princess?" Edric asked gently. "I miss my friends at the orphanage," Ella replied with a sniff, her voice muffled by his chest. "Can we go as a family?" She glanced up then to look at me, and I froze, taken aback by her use of the word family. Edric looked up as well, and I could tell that he was just as taken aback as I was. He stared at me for several long moments, both of us frozen. His steely gray eyes were softer than usual, and in that moment, I felt Mina rousing inside of me. Finally, he licked his lips and spoke, never releasing his gaze from mine. "Yes," he said quietly, "we can all go tomorrow." Moana. That night, after Ella calmed down enough and agreed to clean up her room with our help, I laid in bed and found myself unable to sleep following the events of the day. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the creepy man from the mall. Even more than that, however, I pictured Edric's soft eyes staring up at me as he held Ella on the floor, and I felt his protective arm around my shoulders. I decided eventually that I couldn't sleep for a while, so I decided to get my sketchbook out and draw. Although I had been working on another sketch for the past couple of days, I decided to turn to a fresh page that night and draw a scene that I couldn't get out of my head. The image of Edric holding Ella in her princess costume. As I drew, starting with the rough forms of Edric and Ella, a soft smile inadvertently began to spread across my lips. That smile spread as I began to feel Mina's presence. It had been a few days since I really felt her presence, but I could tell that the events of the day made her come out more. I was grateful. Mina had become a friend to me, in a strange way. "I have a confession," she said finally after hanging around in my mind in silence for several minutes. I said out loud. I still wasn't entirely used to the whole concept of conversing with her in my head, and as I was distracted from my drawing, I didn't think much of it now. "Last night, I released a little more of my scent when he hugged you." I looked up from my sketchbook and frowned, setting my pencil down. "I thought we agreed on you not doing that without my permission," I said quietly. Mina was quiet for a few moments before answering. When she did finally answer, she sounded a little embarrassed. "I really didn't mean to. It was an accident." "Well, what happened then?" I asked. "When he hugged you, I just couldn't control myself. It's getting harder to control it." I furrowed my brow. Could that mean... No, Edric wasn't my mate. If he was, we would have noticed a lot sooner, right? I went to search for Mina's presence again to ask her, but when I did, she was gone again. Sighing, I knew I especially wouldn't be able to sleep now, so I decided to get up and head to the kitchen to make myself some tea. It was hot, so I stayed only in my nightgown. The apartment was quiet when I slipped out of my room. As I made my way over to the kitchen, I figured that everyone else was already fast asleep. But I realized that I was wrong when I suddenly heard the sound of Edric's aggravated voice coming from his office. Unable to contain my curiosity, I meandered a little closer to the closed door and listened. "What makes you think you have the right to care about my personal affairs?" he said, his voice muffled through the door. "You threw away that right when you decided to screw me over all those years ago." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the phone. I furrowed my brow, but kept listening. "No? Olivia?" The name Olivia sounded familiar. I blinked as I tried to recall where I had heard that name before, but it finally hit me. I had heard him use that name once before in a situation very similar to this. I had overheard him talking about money and using that name very late one night. Who was this Olivia person? Was she a friend? A family member? Edric certainly didn't sound terribly fond of her, though, and it almost seemed as though they had some sort of disdain for each other, although the reason behind that was a mystery to me. Unfortunately, as I continued to stand there and puzzle over whoever this Olivia woman was, I was too deeply lost in thought to notice that Edric hung up the phone and walked over to the door. In fact, I was completely taken by surprise when he suddenly flung the door open. I jumped back in surprise, my eyes wide, while Edric just stood in the doorway and stared at me. "What are you doing up?" he asked. I couldn't sleep," I said, my heart racing. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." Edric stared at me for several more long, silent moments. The air in the room was thick and hot, and I half expected him to snap at me for eavesdropping, but he didn't. Instead, he merely shrugged and shuffled over to the bar in the living room and muttered something incoherent to himself as he rummaged around in the dim light for a drink. I watched him for a moment, taking in his slightly haggard appearance, but felt the overwhelming urge to stop him as he pulled out a whiskey bottle and unscrewed the cap. "I was just about to make tea," I interrupted, causing him to pause just before he began to pour the whiskey into a glass. "Let me make you a cup instead of alcohol." Edric paused, his hand still poised with the bottle to pour. But after a few moments of somber contemplation, he surprisingly lowered the bottle and nodded as he screwed the cap back on. "All right," he said. "I'll take some tea." I couldn't help but smile. I'd noticed that Edric seemed to be drinking a little less recently, or at the very least he seemed more receptive to other options. If I hadn't stopped him tonight, I wondered to myself if he would have gotten too drunk. His argument with this mysterious Olivia seemed to have taken a lot out of him. "Come on," I said, gesturing to the kitchen. Edric silently followed me to the kitchen, then sat on a stool at the kitchen island while I filled up the kettle with water and put it on the stove. It was dark, and neither of us bothered to turn the overhead lights on, but I had become so used to the layout of the kitchen already that I knew where everything was. The city lights illuminated the room just enough through the window for me to be able to make out Edric's somber, brooding expression as he stared down at his hands on the counter. "I know you heard me," he finally said after some time, "just like before." I cleared my throat as I looked at him, still unable to hide my curiosity. "If you don't mind me asking, was it the same person as before, too?" After I spoke, I felt a knot form in my throat, and I hoped that I didn't agitate Edric any further. Much to my surprise, he nodded. "Yes," he admitted. "Someone from my past. They've been bothering me. They usually start up again around this time every year, because—" He stopped then, seemingly not wanting to say any more. As I looked at him, I could tell just from the look in his eyes that he already felt as though he said too much. Moana. Much to my surprise, the aloof alpha billionaire almost began to open up for a brief moment. Almost. "Yes," he admitted when I asked if the person he was arguing with tonight was the same person who I overheard him arguing with before all those weeks ago. His voice was low and strained, like there wasn't enough room in his throat to get everything out in one breath. "Someone from my past. They've been bothering me. They usually start up again around this time every year, because—" The dark kitchen fell quiet after Edric suddenly stopped himself from saying more. He kept his eyes fixed on his hands as they sat clasped together on the kitchen counter, but I could tell just from the look on his face and the way his body suddenly tensed that he already felt as though he said too much. I didn't know who this mysterious Olivia woman was, or why she apparently popped back into Edric's life to supposedly harass him around this time every year, but I decided not to pry any further. Clearly, whoever she was a sore subject for the alpha billionaire, and if I learned one thing about him over the past few months since I'd met him, it was that it was just better most of the time to let him decide to open up to me in his own time. Prying wouldn't get me anywhere, and it would likely only make him distance himself further from me. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence as the water slowly came to a boil in the kettle behind me, I finally spoke. "You don't have to tell me any details if you don't want to," I said quietly. But just know that I'm always here to listen if you need advice or even if you just need to vent." Slowly, Edric raised his eyes to meet mine. His face had softened, and there was a sense of melancholy behind his gaze that I couldn't quite understand. He simply nodded in response, then quickly looked away. The tea began to boil, causing the kettle to start whistling behind me. I took it as my opportunity to look away and maybe change the subject, so I quickly turned around, ignoring the butterflies in my stomach, and turned the burner off. I then filled the tea infuser with 2 scoops of chamomile tea leaves, then set it in the teapot and slowly poured the hot water over it. As I did, I felt the aromatic steam rise up and dampen my face. But I also felt something else: warm, soft hands around my waist. I suddenly stopped pouring the tea, feeling Edric's hands slowly slide around my waist. He pressed his body up behind me, his hands resting on my belly, feeling how it was beginning to protrude slightly. At first, I thought that he was just feeling emotional about the baby and wanted to touch my belly, but as his body pressed more firmly into me and I felt his breathing deepen and thicken, I knew that it was something else. I set the kettle down on the counter, then slowly turned my head to look up at him. When I did, I saw that he was gazing down at me. His eyes were no longer gray, but were glowing silver again, just as they did in the mall. Only this time, they weren't glowing from anger, but rather from arousal. They flickered down to my mouth then, and I saw him lick his lips. "Edric." My voice was low and thick. I felt the butterflies in my stomach travel down further into my groin as his hands gently tugged my hips closer to him. Without a word, Edric slowly bent down and pressed his lips against mine. His lips were warm and soft, and as he kissed me deeply and his tongue began to work its way into my mouth, his right hand slid up my belly, over my breasts and up to my neck, while his left hand lingered over my stomach. At that moment, I swore I heard a low, aching moan rumble in his throat, as though something stirred inside of him to take our kiss further. I wanted to take it further, too, and I could feel Mina's presence strengthening for the 3rd time that day. But then, just as suddenly as it happened, Edric suddenly pulled away. He almost stumbled backwards, taking me by surprise, and passed a hand over his face as he shook his head vigorously. "I'm sorry," he muttered, backing up against the kitchen island behind him and then sidestepping to get around it, all while keeping his gaze averted to the floor. I kept my back turned, staring down at the half-filled teapot in front of me as I felt my heart palpitate and my face get hot and red. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing would come out. And by that point, he was already by the door. "I'm tired," he said, his voice ragged. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking." I spun around, then to face him, and went to say something as Mina pleaded inside of me to make him stay. But I knew that whatever I said would fall on deaf ears. Edric seemed to have made up his mind, and besides, I knew that he would never make the mistake of sleeping with me again. I was, after all, still the nanny. "I'm going to bed. I don't want tea anymore, but thank you for the offer." Without another word, Edric abruptly turned on his heel and stormed off, leaving me alone in the dark kitchen. I listened to the fading sound of his footsteps, followed by the sound of his bedroom door clicking shut. Finally, I let out a ragged breath and blinked rapidly to diffuse the tears that had already welled up in my eyes. Deep down, I knew that he could never really be with me because of the vast differences in our social classes. I knew that, but it didn't mean that it hurt any less when we so clearly wanted each other, and our social classes were keeping us from even being intimate in private. I wanted so badly to storm over to his door and burst into his bedroom, demanding that he make love to me tonight, but I knew that it would get us nowhere. As I stood there, frozen in the dark kitchen, the only movement I could feel was the pained fluttering in my heart. Mina's strength quickly faded as she came to the realization that I wouldn't be intimate with Edric tonight. Finally, I felt as though my own energy had been sapped. When Edric walked away, it felt as though the rug had been pulled out from underneath me, and I was now teetering in my spot. I didn't even want tea anymore. I only wanted to crawl into my bed and cry myself to sleep. And so, I left the half-filled pot of tea on the counter and returned to my bedroom. That night, I curled up beneath my blanket, feeling oddly cold for such a hot night. "Edric," I made a mistake that night kissing Moana. As I rushed back to my room and shut the door behind myself, I leaned my head back against the door and cursed at myself under my breath. How could I be so stupid? I was a fool for not controlling myself around her, and now things were going to be even more confusing between us. Her curves beneath her thin nightgown were too tempting, and I couldn't control the urge to touch her. Even now, I could still feel her belly beneath my hands and the taste of her lips on my tongue. I shook my head to dispel the thoughts, telling myself over and over again that I got too close. As I got ready for bed and laid down, I kept having to erase the inappropriate thoughts from my mind, but I couldn't. Would I have to buy Moana a penthouse and keep a distance from her, just like I did with Ella's mother, Olivia? At the same time, however, it pained my soul to even imagine doing something like that. Over the course of just a couple of short months, I already couldn't imagine a life without Moana here, and I knew it would only scar Ella emotionally after she became so attached to Moana. Not only that, but it would hurt Ella to see her new sibling be sent away like that. No, I couldn't send Moana away. I was just tired, and my tiredness caused me to make a mistake. If I could just sleep, it would all be better in the morning, and I could deal with it then. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing how beautiful Moana's body looked on the night of our one-night stand, and how sensual she had been. Admittedly, it even made me too aroused to sleep, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't go to her room, but I also couldn't be in this house. So I decided to get dressed again and go out to the bar for a drink. I quickly texted my nighttime driver, who was on call for nights like this, and told him that I would be down shortly. Within half an hour, I was at my bar, the same bar that I took Moana to on the night we met. As I made my way inside the quiet bar, I shoved the images of how she'd looked that night out of my mind and headed up the stairs. There were only a few people in the bar, some businessmen who were regular patrons, as well as a few others. I kept my head down and sat at the bar. "Good evening, Mr. Morgan," the bartender said, sounding a bit surprised. "What can I get for you?" "The usual," I said gruffly. "Whiskey, neat." The bartender nodded and poured my whiskey, then set it down in front of me and walked away to give me some space. As I drank, I stared down at the wood of the bar and cursed myself inwardly for being such a fool tonight. I should have told Moana that I was going to bed to begin with. I never should have agreed to have tea with her. I'd gotten too comfortable after our day at the mall, and her beauty in that final dress she tried on blinded my senses. Not only that, but the incident with the creep who was trying to hit on her made me feel too protective and filled me with a sense of deep emotion for the human nanny. Maybe it was just because it had been so long since I had been intimate with anyone else, I thought to myself. Moana was the first after a long, dry spell, and I hadn't even looked in another woman's direction since then. Maybe, if I distracted myself, I wouldn't think so much about her anymore. And it seemed that the universe sent me that perfect opportunity, because as I sat there, stewing in my own juices, I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking toward me. I looked up to see a gorgeous, sultry woman with dark eyes and dark hair approaching me. She was wearing a slinky black dress and incredibly high heels, and her breasts bounced lightly beneath her dress. I could see her nipples through the thin fabric of her dress, and it instantly made me hard. She shot me a sultry smile as she sauntered up to me, then leaned on the bar next to me with her back arched and waved the bartender over. "Gin and tonic, please, bartender," she said, her voice low and thick. She sounded as though she'd already had a few drinks. "Put it on my tab," I said to the bartender over my shoulder as I looked her up and down. The woman turned to face me and shot me another smile. "So forward," she said. "It's almost like you want something from me." I shrugged and finished off the rest of the whiskey in my glass, tapping the glass twice on the bar for a refill. "Maybe I do," I said, "if you're willing." The woman's smile stretched further across her thin face. She batted her eyelashes and gestured to the bathrooms with a simple nod of her head. Within a couple of minutes, before she even had her drink, we were in the bathroom together, with her sitting on the sinks as I bit into her neck and ran my hands up her thighs. Her skin was smooth and soft, and when I ran my hand up her skirt, I could feel that she already wasn't wearing panties. This realization only made me more aroused, and I didn't stop her when she reached down to fumble with my belt. A sly smile stretched across her face as she reached down my pants and felt my erection, eliciting a soft moan from my lips. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back, and Moana's soft face flashed through my mind from the night we slept together. The way her full lips were parted, her back arched beneath me. She was beautiful, more beautiful than this strange woman from the bar. I suddenly opened my eyes again and stumbled backwards, shaking my head. "What's the matter?" the woman said, cocking her head and pouting. I only kept shaking my head and dug into my wallet, pulling out a wad of cash and tossing it in her lap. The woman rolled her eyes, but took the cash and shoved it into her cleavage before hopping down off of the sinks and strutting off without a word. I stood there, panting for a moment, as I buckled my belt again and cursed under my breath. That human nanny would get the best of me somehow. Why couldn't I stop thinking about her for just one night? I returned to my driver without having my second drink and ordered him to take me home. As we passed by the city lights, I could only think about how everything that happened tonight was nothing but a huge mistake. Moana. Somehow I managed to fall asleep that night. In the morning, I woke up with a headache after the night spent in emotional distress. Edric and I had kissed last night in the darkness of the kitchen. Even now, I could still feel his hands on my waist and could feel his body pressed up against mine. Even now, I could still taste his lips and his tongue, and I had spent the night dreaming about him. The sun was shining through my bedroom window, but I just wanted to go back to the darkness of the night before and be with Edric. I hadn't realized it before, but I was admittedly lonely, and his touch was welcome. I hadn't been with anyone since our one-night stand and didn't realize how starved I was for intimacy with another adult. To add insult to injury, I felt like an idiot for thinking for even one moment that Edric was beginning to fall for me. The way he doted on me while we went shopping together despite the tabloid incident. The way that he scared away the creepy man at the mall and put his arm around me protectively, genuinely worried for my health and safety. The way that he kissed me so gently in the kitchen. Was any of that even real? Or was it just a moment of weakness on his part? Was he lonely too and just looking for intimacy? As I laid there, I remembered that Edric and I promised to take Ella to the orphanage today so she could play with her friends. Even though I didn't particularly want to see Edric after our kiss in the kitchen the night before, I knew that I would have to see him eventually, so I groaned and got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee and ease my headache. When I walked through the living room, however, the soft sound of snoring caught my attention. I furrowed my brow and peered over the couch to see Edric sprawled out. He was dressed up with his shoes on as though he'd gone out, and there was an empty bottle of whiskey sitting on the floor next to him. I was astonished. Ella couldn't see him like this. It would confuse her too much to see her father passed out drunk on the couch, so without taking a second thought, I snatched the empty alcohol bottle up off the floor and abruptly shook Edric's shoulder. Edric's eyes snapped open and he groaned as he came to his senses. Before he even had a chance to say anything, I shoved the bottle in his face and frowned deeply. "I know that you got upset last night, but this is unacceptable," I said, gesturing to his appearance. "Your daughter will be awake soon. It's a good thing I found you before she came out here." Edric's eyes widened momentarily as he looked at the bottle. He slowly sat up and swung his legs over the side of the couch, then stood after pausing for a moment. He didn't seem to want to look at me. "I'm sorry," he said, taking the bottle out of my hands. "It's really not as bad as it looks. The bottle was almost empty, and I just got too tired. I wasn't drunk." As he reached for the bottle and leaned closer to me, however, I suddenly got a whiff of something other than alcohol. Something sickly sweet and flowery. Perfume. Women's perfume, to be exact. Did Edric have a one-night stand last night, right after our kiss in the kitchen? The smell of the cheap perfume made my head reel, and I instantly became nauseous. I quickly covered my nose and mouth with my hand and stumbled backwards, shaking my head vigorously as tears welled up in my eyes. "What's wrong?" Edric asked, taking a step toward me. As he did, The smell of the perfume hit my nose again, and I covered up a gag with my hand. The smell was too strong, and I could only imagine the father of my baby sleeping with a strange woman at the bar, or even a prostitute. I couldn't tell what made me more sick, the smell or the thought of him being with someone else. To think that Edric not only went out drinking right after our kiss in the kitchen, but also had a one-night stand on top of it, it made my heart hurt. Inside of me, Mina became stronger, but not out of love this time. Rather, she became stronger with rage, like a lion pacing in its cage at the zoo. I could tell that she felt just as betrayed as I did right now. But I had to hold my head high for Ella, and despite Edric's confused look as I stepped away from him, I lowered my hand and tilted my chin up confidently. "Don't forget that we promised Ella we'd take her to the orphanage today," I said. My voice shook a little as I spoke, but I tried to hide it. After everything, I couldn't let Edric see me get emotional over his one-night stand with another woman, even though Mina was reacting strongly to the cheap scent as well. Edric only sighed and walked over to the kitchen, where he tossed the empty bottle in the trash. I followed him, waiting to see what he would say about his promise to poor little Ella. And, to no surprise, he said exactly what I expected. "Maybe we should go another day," he said quietly, running a hand through his hair and straightening his shirt. My jaw dropped. For Ella's sake, even more than my own, I was furious. How could he really be so willing to drop his plans with his daughter because he irresponsibly went out, had a one-night stand, and got too drunk to even make it to his bedroom? By this point, I forgot all about how this supposed one-night stand even made me feel, and I felt the need to argue for Ella's sake. She needed to spend time with her father. Clearly, she was beginning to feel abandoned. Just because you got too drunk last night doesn't mean that you get to just disappoint your daughter like that, I said. Without thinking and without caring about the smell that made me sick, I stormed up to him and grabbed his tie, taking him by surprise. "You should be ashamed of yourself. What will Ella think?" Edric stared down at me with shock written plainly across his face. "I told you I wasn't drunk," he said. "What's gotten into you?" I realized what I was doing and quickly released my grip on his tie, then turned on my heel and walked a few paces away. I paused then, clenching and unclenching my fists as I blinked away the tears in my eyes. Finally, I turned back to face him. "I really can't believe you," I whispered. "To have a one-night stand like that, not only right after you came on to me, but also on the night before you're supposed to have a wholesome day with your daughter, it makes me sick." Moana. To have a one-night stand like that, not only right after you came on to me, but also on the night before you're supposed to have a wholesome day with your daughter, it makes me sick. Edric's eyes widened at my words. "Moana, I think you've got the wrong idea," he said abruptly, taking a few steps toward me and folding his arms across his chest with a huff. "I didn't sleep with anyone last night," I scoffed and shook my head. "I can smell the cheap perfume all over you," I replied. "It stinks." Now it was Edric who scoffed. "It's not like that. But honestly, Moana, you and I are not together. It's not really up to you who I see in my free time." As Edric spoke, I felt my eyes begin to well up with tears. But I had to stay strong for Ella, just like I told myself earlier. I couldn't let Edric or Ella see me cry today. Blinking rapidly to dispel the tears, I quickly turned on my heel and headed for the door. "Well, I'm taking Ella to the orphanage, just like I promised," I said coldly. "Whether or not you want to go is up to you, but we'll go without you if we have to." Edric let out a sound that came across as disbelieving as I walked away from him. "I won't be going, then," Edric called after me, running over to the kitchen doorway as I stormed off. "Really, Moana? I'm tired of your insolence." I didn't answer. Blinking back more tears, I retreated to my room. Later, just as I promised, I took Ella to the orphanage. We got dressed and headed down to the lobby. Edric was nowhere to be found, just as I expected. As I put Ella into her car seat, she swung her legs and looked at me with a confused expression on her little face. "Moana, where's Daddy?" she asked. "He's busy." I lied as I imagined him sulking in his study more than anything. I secretly hoped that he felt badly for what he did, but I also was beginning to doubt that the alpha billionaire felt much of anything at this point. "But," Ella pushed out her lower lip in a pout, He promised we would go together, as a family. I know, sweetheart, I said softly as I got into the car with her. We'll go as a family another time. You like just going with me, right? Ella paused, sniffling as tears began to well up in her eyes. But she nodded nonetheless and held my hand for the entire car ride. Thankfully, by the time we arrived at the orphanage, Ella was too excited about seeing her friends to pout anymore about her father's broken promise. Almost as soon as we stepped through the front doors, she ran off to play with her friends. I grinned as I heard a chorus of other children yelling Ella's name excitedly as she disappeared into the recreation room, and made my way over to the kitchen to find Sophia. Sophia wasn't in the kitchen, so I made my way upstairs to her office and found her rifling through her filing cabinets and muttering to herself. I quietly knocked on the door as I entered. Just a moment, she said absent-mindedly. Her back was turned to me, so I figured that she thought I was one of the children. Busy? I asked. Sophia immediately perked up and spun around to face me. A smile spread across her tired face, and she scurried over to me, pulling me into a tight hug. "Moana," she said. "I'm so glad to see you." Thankfully, I was wearing a loose outfit, so she didn't notice my slightly protruding belly as she hugged me. I was relieved because I didn't feel like addressing it today. Not after what happened with Edric. Once again, I wondered to myself if I should save my money and try to start a new life with my baby at the first opportunity. But Ella was quickly becoming like a daughter to me, and I wasn't sure if I could leave her behind. "I'm glad to see you as well," I said, managing a smile. "What are you doing? You seem busy." Sophia turned back to look at her filing cabinets and let out a deep sigh. "I'm afraid I'm stretched a little thin right now," she said. "I really need a secretary, but it's just so darn expensive these days, and I want to make sure that I can pay someone well for the job. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't give someone the pay they deserve." I nodded, smiling at the older woman's kind-hearted nature. Although the foundation for the orphanage seemed to be doing well at the gala, I was certain that a lot of the money went toward repairing the orphanage, purchasing supplies and clothing for the children, and putting money away in savings for the children when they grew up, so it made sense that Sophia wouldn't have the extra cash to pay a receptionist. Now, more than ever, she was probably neck-deep in paperwork because of the foundation. "You know, I can always help you on my days off," I said. "I'll volunteer. Want me to help you today?" Sophia's shoulders drooped a little and she shook her head. "No, I couldn't possibly let you do paperwork on your day off," she said. "But maybe... Would you mind watching the children for a little while?" "Sure," I said. "I'll give them an art lesson." With a smile, Sophia hugged me again. "Thank you so much," she said warmly. "You have no idea how much that helps." If I was being honest, I was really only glad to just have a good distraction for the day. I let Sophia return to her paperwork and headed back downstairs, where I found the kids still playing in the recreation room. At the mention of an art lesson, they all jumped up from their game excitedly. I couldn't help but smile at the children. And as I put on mine and the children's smocks and prepared the painting supplies, I was already feeling better. Maybe this was exactly what I needed, and maybe volunteering regularly on my days off would be helpful with everything going on at home. "Okay, everyone," I said, clapping my hands to get the excited children's attention. "We're going to paint flowers today?" I started the lesson by painting a simple demonstration for the kids, then walked around the room and guided them as they sloppily painted their flowers. Eventually, the lesson devolved into finger painting and making a mess, and the children seemed to be intent on painting anything but flowers, from pictures of dogs to stick figures. But I didn't mind. The children's happiness was all I needed to feel better and forget about Edric. However, halfway through the lesson, I heard the floorboard creak from the doorway. Thinking it was Sophia, I looked up with a smile, but that smile faded as I saw that Edric was standing there, Moana. As I walked around the room and helped the children with their art, I suddenly heard the sound of the floorboards creaking in the doorway. Thinking that it was Sophia coming to check on how everything was going, I looked up with a smile. That smile quickly faded, however, when I realized it wasn't Sophia, but was in fact Edric who was standing there. He had an indiscernible expression on his face and stood as still as a statue in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, his eyes locked on mine for several long, palpable moments. Was I seeing things, or had the cold alpha billionaire finally realized the fault in breaking his promise to his daughter? But before I could even process the fact that he apparently seemed to have changed his mind for whatever reason, Ella snapped her head up and gasped loudly. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, jumping up out of her chair and running up to him. "You came!" Edric put on a smile and scooped Ella up, hugging her tightly and planting a kiss on her cheek, while the other children also threw down their paintbrushes and ran up to him. "Mr. Morgan!" they shouted excitedly, jumping up and down on their toes as they swarmed around him. Much to my surprise, Edric set Ella down and then proceeded to greet each and every child, by name, no less. "Hello, Clara," he said, pinching the little girl's cheek. "Hello, Matthew. Nice shirt you've got on today. Joshua." While all of this went on, I just stood there in a state of abject shock, with wide eyes and an open mouth. It seemed that the alpha billionaire changed his mind after all, and wound up keeping his promise to his daughter. That didn't mean that I wasn't still furious with him, not only for initially breaking his promise, but also for reeking of women's perfume and being passed out drunkenly on the couch. But my attitude softened toward him a little bit as I watched him being so kind with the children. Finally, Edric stood and looked straight at me. "Am I interrupting an art lesson?" he asked. Well, I stuttered, still taken off guard. Before I could get my words out, thankfully Ella stepped in. "We're painting flowers, Daddy," she said, grabbing his hand and leading him over to her workstation while the other children returned to their paintings. "Ooh." Edric stuck his hands in his pockets as he peered down at his daughter's canvas, which contained anything but a flower at this point. "That's very good, Ella," he said. Ella grinned. "Are you going to paint with us?" "Oh, honey, I don't know." "Please," Ella begged, clasping her hands together. Edric finally shrugged and nodded, letting out a sigh. "All right," he said, "I'll paint with you." Even though I was supposed to be mad at Edric right now, the fact that he agreed to join the lesson made my attitude toward him soften even more. Without a word, I walked over to the supply cabinet and grabbed a spare apron for him to wear, then handed it to him along with a small canvas and a paintbrush. "There are paints on the tables," I said, gesturing around. Edric silently took the apron and hesitantly put it on, then made his way over to one of the tables and sat down. He looked comically large in the chair that was meant for a child, causing the other children to giggle and point. But, much to my surprise, he only smiled and began to spread paint on his canvas. Soon we'd all returned to our lesson. The children seemed to be having even more fun now with the alpha billionaire, who painted rather sloppily and wound up splattering quite a bit of paint on his sleeves. The children pointed and poked fun at him, but he didn't seem to mind the paint getting on his nice white shirt, and only laughed along with them, poking fun at himself as well. The lesson went on for much longer than expected because of this, but I didn't mind. Soon I'd almost entirely forgotten about the perfume and our subsequent argument, and only found myself smiling and laughing along with Edric and the children. The alpha billionaire was a surprisingly bad artist, and almost seemed as though he'd never even picked up a paintbrush before in his entire life. Watching him struggle was endearing, and at one point I watched with a tear in my eye as one of the children walked up to him and put her little hand around his while he painted, guiding his hand along the canvas. Finally, however, the lesson had to come to an end. I clapped my hands to get the children's and Edric's attention, then instructed them to get up and walk around to look at everyone else's artwork. "Remember, no touching," I said, watching as the children milled around and looked at their peers' artwork. Edric stood as well and joined them. He almost looked like a big kid on his own, wandering around with his hands clasped behind his back. It admittedly made me smile a bit, and I didn't even mind that he seemed to be avoiding eye contact with me. Finally, the group stopped at Edric's station last. There was a long silence as the children stared down at his artwork, which was a sloppy mess that didn't even remotely resemble a flower. Just then, Clara pointed her stubby little finger and giggled. "Mr. Morgan," she said, Don't you know what a flower looks like? Yeah, Joshua added. That looks like a… It looks like a hot dog, with hair, Ella yelled, causing the children to erupt in a chorus of giggles. I finally walked over and looked down at the painting. It did, in fact, look like a hot dog with hair. The stem of the flower was thick and red, and the petals were just big brown swirls that resembled a mop of curly hair. If he'd added a bun and a smiley face and maybe some arms and legs, it easily could have been a children's cartoon character. Stifling a laugh, I opened my mouth to tell the children to be nice. But before I could, the alpha billionaire threw his head back and laughed loudly, slapping his paint-covered hand on his apron. His laughter caused the children to laugh even more and even brought a smile to my face. I wasn't sure if I was smiling more because it was funny, however, or if I was smiling because it made me happy to see the cold werewolf CEO so full of joy. I guess you're right, now that I look at it, he said finally, wiping away the tears that formed in his eyes from laughing so hard. I guess I'm not an artist, am I? Edric then turned to look at me. His steely gray eyes, which had just been full of mirth, softened as we looked at each other. I could sense an apologetic air about his expression, and it made my heart flutter a bit. Well, I said finally, clearing my throat, everyone can be an artist with plenty of practice. Edric nodded. Maybe my skills will get better with more of your lessons, Miss Moana, he said. Moana. My head was still reeling from Edric's sudden change of heart and change of attitude when one of the children, Clara, suddenly spoke up. Moana, she whined, can we have ice cream, please? It's so hot out. The little girl's request tore me away from my thoughts, and I nodded in agreement as all of the other children began to join in and beg for a frozen treat. It was hot out today, and the mention of something cold and refreshing to eat got me a little excited as well. Okay, I said. Let's have some ice cream. The children cheered excitedly as they followed me to the kitchen. Edric followed at the back of the group, but only because Ella grabbed his hand and yanked him along unceremoniously. When I got to the kitchen and opened the freezer, however, I was disappointed to see that there was no ice cream or any sort of frozen treat. Sorry, guys, Pat, I said with a sigh, turning to face the disappointed children. Looks like there isn't any. The children all began to pout dramatically. I was just about to send them off to play and get their minds off of the subject when Sophia suddenly appeared in the doorway, looking confused. What's wrong? She asked, breaking the silence as she looked around at all of the sad little faces. There's no ice cream, Clara said. The little girl had her lower lip pushed out into a distinct pout and even somehow managed to muster up a few tears in her big blue eyes. It's so hot out, Sophia sighed. Yes. Sorry, I need to do some shopping. I've been so busy. I'll take everyone out for ice cream. Everyone turned to face Edric, shocked by the alpha billionaire's sudden and generous offer. Oh, you don't have to, Sophia began, but Edric stopped her. Really, it'll be fun. It's on me. My eyes were wide as I looked back and forth between Edric and the equally shocked Sophia. Before either of us could say anything, however, the children suddenly erupted into a grating chorus of excited shrieks and cheers, making my ears ring. I couldn't help but smile, though, and neither could Sophia. All right, she said as Clara and a couple of the other children began pleading and tugging on her skirt frantically. Everyone, go to the closet and get your shoes and your sun hats. Hurry up. With one final cheer, the children all took off in one big stampede to get ready for the walk, leaving only Edric, Sophia, and I standing alone in the kitchen. This is very kind of you, Edric, Sophia said with a tired smile. I'll pay you back as soon as I can. Nonsense, Edric interrupted. It will be a cold day in hell when I ask you to repay me for ice cream. Sophia's face went a little red. Well, thank you. I'll go and get the children ready. With that, she scurried off. I swore I could see a bit of a tear in her eye just before she left, but I couldn't be entirely sure. Now, Edric and I were alone. I didn't know what to say. I was speechless. His attitude that morning had been so indifferent and cold, and now here he was, joining us for art lessons, laughing and joking with the children, and taking everyone out for ice cream. If I wasn't still so hurt by his apparent one-night stand with a mystery woman, I would have been softened by his kind behavior, but admittedly, I was still having a difficult time getting over that. Suddenly, Edric turned to look at me. He opened his mouth to speak, and for a fleeting moment I thought that maybe he would apologize for his behavior that morning. But he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved 2 blue surgical masks. He quickly walked up to me and handed it to me with a somber look on his face. "Make sure you wear this," he said. "It's still risky." I was dumbfounded by his request. I took the mask but felt taken aback that that was really all he had to say to me. No apology? Nothing? It didn't matter anyhow. With nothing but one more single, lingering look at me, Edric suddenly turned on his heel and walked out to meet Sophia and the children in the foyer. I stared after him for a few moments, still in a state of disbelief, before letting out a deep sigh and following him. When I walked out into the foyer, the place was filled with the chaos of a dozen excited little children getting ready to go get ice cream. Seeing the children so excited temporarily made me forget about my annoyance with Edric, so I helped Sophia get the children ready. Finally, after everyone was ready and I had my own mask on, we filed out of the orphanage and began the walk to a nearby ice cream parlor. Edric walked at the front, while Sophia and I walked at the back, instructing the children to hold hands and stay in a single-file line as we walked. We walked through a little park on the way. The shade from the trees and the cool spray of water coming off of the fountains was a welcome relief from the dry heat of the afternoon, and the sound of the birds singing and the children chattering happily made a smile come to my face beneath my mask. Meanwhile, Edric walked in solitude at the front of the group. Sophia hung back with me, and we talked as we watched the alpha billionaire walk ahead of us. "What's up with the mask, if you don't mind me asking?" Sophia asked quietly. "I mean, I understand why he's wearing one, but you—" I shook my head. "Tabloids are just starting to get the wrong idea," I said, still not mentioning the pregnancy to her. "That's all." "Ah!" Sophia nodded, mulling over my words for a few minutes before speaking again. "You know, he really seems so much different now. It's like he's not even the same WearCorp CEO that I met that first day at the orphanage. He's really changed for the better, don't you think?" I stared ahead at Edric's back as he walked. He was holding Ella's hand, who was holding the child's hand behind her, and so on. Ella chattered happily about ice cream flavors, and although I couldn't see Edric's face, I knew that he was probably happy to be out on a nice day with his daughter. But at the same time, I just couldn't get over the smell of perfume on his clothes from that morning. At that point, I was more bothered by that than the fact that he drunkenly fell asleep on the couch, fully clothed with an empty whiskey bottle. If he wanted to go out for a bit, then that was up to him. But to go out with another woman and use it as an excuse to disappoint his daughter earlier? Even if he did have a change of heart and wound up making up for it, I still found it to be deplorable. "Honestly," Sophia continued, breaking me out of my train of thought, "I think that you've had a positive impact on him." It was then that I shook my head, my eyes still fixed on the alpha billionaire's back. "I'm not sure how much he's changed," I said quietly. "Moana." Sophia didn't ask about Edric again after that. I knew that she could tell that something more was going on than I was leading her to believe, but she didn't pry any further and just enjoyed the remainder of the walk with me. We talked a bit about her plans with the foundation a bit, as well as her need for a secretary to help her out. Up ahead, as we talked about the secretary, I swore I could see Edric glancing over his shoulder at us as though he was listening intently. Finally, we made it to the ice cream parlor. It was a cute little mom-and-pop shop on a small strip of quaint little stores, and when we went inside, it was like stepping back in time. There was a long counter with stools to sit at, and there was a nice older man working behind the counter wearing a red and white striped uniform. "Well, hello there," the old man said cheerfully as we entered. "So many little ones." Sophia and I smiled and helped the children sit at the counter. Once they were all seated, we stood with Edric as there were no chairs left. "What can I get for everyone?" the old man asked, leaning on the counter and beaming at the children who all looked over at Sophia expectantly. "Go ahead and tell the nice man which flavor you would like," Sophia said in an encouraging tone. Almost all at once, the children started bombarding the old man with the flavors of their choice, but he somehow managed to get all of their orders just right. Sophia also ordered a bowl of chocolate ice cream, and I ordered French vanilla. The old man handed us our ice cream, and Sophia thanked both him and Edric profusely while Edric paid. The ice cream was refreshing after being outside on such a hot day. French vanilla was always a favorite flavor of mine, and I couldn't help but smile a bit as I tasted the sweet coolness of it on my tongue. I noticed, however, that Edric didn't seem to get himself any ice cream. "Aren't you going to have any?" I asked, furrowing my brow. It felt a bit odd having him pay for all of us, but not get anything for himself. Edric shook his head. "I don't really eat ice cream, so I'm not sure what I would have," he admitted. The children's mouths dropped almost in unison. "You don't eat ice cream?" Clara insisted. "That's crazy talk." "Clara, be nice," Sophia chimed in, stifling a laugh. I could tell that Edric didn't quite know how to react, so without thinking, I scooped up a bit of ice cream on my spoon and held it out for him. "Here," I said, "try mine. It's not too sweet." Edric's eyes widened for a moment. He seemed to be struggling over whether he should move his mask down to taste the ice cream, but I had been comfortable since the moment we came in here, as the nice old man was the only other person here and seemed to be the type to be entirely indifferent to celebrities. Edric, seemingly coming to the same conclusion, finally tugged his mask down a little and ate the ice cream right off the spoon without even taking it out of my hand like I had expected. I noticed that his cheeks turned a little red as he tasted the ice cream on his tongue, but he quickly nodded and turned away before I had a chance to tease him about it. "I'll take whichever flavor she had," he said. "French vanilla it is," the old man replied with a smile. Edric watched intently, almost in a childlike way, as the old man plopped 2 scoops of ice cream into the bowl, drizzled a little caramel on top, and handed it to Edric. As we ate, listening to the children as they prattled on to each other about this or that, I couldn't stop thinking about how good Edric's attitude was now compared to this morning. Even though I was still a bit hurt after everything, it was nice to see him acting so friendly and open with Sophia and the children, and his offer to take everyone out for ice cream was still a shock. Not only that, but the fact that he ate the ice cream right off of my spoon with very little hesitation and seemed to like it enough to order some for himself was blowing my mind. But, then again, I knew that there was a good chance that he was only acting so sweet to make his daughter happy. Not that that was necessarily a bad thing, and it was all I really wanted from him to begin with, but I suppose that there was still a part of me that secretly wished that the alpha billionaire would be kind like this out of his own heart and not for any particular reason. Still, I knew that beggars couldn't be choosers, so I decided to take it for what it was and just be happy that he even showed up to begin with. At one point, Sophia turned toward me and stifled a chuckle. "You have ice cream on your cheek," she said, gesturing to her left cheek. I felt my face go red and grabbed a napkin to wipe it off, but missed. "Nope," Sophia said, stifling another laugh. "A little to the left." Once again I missed and felt my face go even more red. Beside me, Edric stopped eating his ice cream and peered over to see what was happening. He caught my eye for a moment, but his gaze quickly shifted over to my cheek, and he shook his head. "Here," he said, holding his cup of ice cream in one hand and walking up to me. Without hesitation, he took me completely by surprise and reached out. "I'll get it." He rubbed his thumb along my cheek before I could even comprehend what was happening. As if my face wasn't red enough as it was, I was certain now that I was the exact shade of a fire engine and felt my heart leap in my chest. His hand lingered on my cheek for a moment as he wiped the ice cream away, and at that moment I forgot where we were entirely as we looked into each other's eyes. But then suddenly, our brief trance was broken. "Oh!" one of the children, Joshua, exclaimed as he pointed his stubby little finger at us. "They're gonna kiss!" The rest of the children erupted into a chorus of oohs and gagging noises. Edric suddenly pulled his hand away and stared at his thumb for a moment before wiping it on his napkin. Now his face was just as red as mine. "There," he said, stepping away. "Got it." All right, Sophia said with a laugh, calming the children. "Be nice. Come on, everyone. Let's finish up so we can go home." The children quickly returned to their ice cream, but my heart was racing too fast now to finish mine. And when I glanced back up at Edric, I swore I caught him glancing at me out of the corner of his eyes. Moana. The children quickly forgot about the emotional moment between Edric and I by the time they finished their ice cream, and we left the ice cream parlor to make our way back to the orphanage. By the time we made it back to the orphanage, the sun was already beginning to set. Ella would have her werewolf training in the morning, so we needed to get home in time for dinner and bedtime. As Ella said her goodbyes to her friends in the foyer, Edric and I stood patiently by the door. Finally, when Ella had hugged all of her new friends as though she would never see them again, I gave Sophia my last goodbye, and we began to head out. "Wait, Mona, Mr. Morgan," Clara's little voice called out, causing us to stop in our tracks. "I have a question." "What is it, Clara?" I asked, feeling a smirk spread across my face at the little girl's urgent demeanor. Well, actually," she turned to face her friends. They all whispered for a moment before Joshua reached out and spun Clara back around to face us. Her face was red from embarrassment. "We want to know, when are you and Mr. Morgan getting married?" I froze, as did Edric beside me. "Clara, let's not ask such personal questions," Sophia said, shooting me an apologetic glance as she walked up to Clara. "Oh, sorry, Moana and Mr. Morgan," Clara said. "It's okay," I replied, crouching down and planting a kiss on the little girl's cheek. I felt bad for not being able to explain anything more, but it wasn't entirely my call. Edric's silence told me that he wasn't ready to talk to outsiders about our situation just yet, and I wanted to respect that. "I'll see you guys later, okay?" "Okay." With that, Edric, Ella, and I returned to the car where the driver was waiting. Edric opened the door for Ella and myself, and while I buckled Ella into her car seat, Edric got in on the other side. The ride home was quiet. Ella seemed too sleepy from her exciting day to say much, and instead swung her legs happily in her seat as she played with the wooden puzzle that I kept in my purse to keep her busy during car rides. Meanwhile, Edric stared quietly out the window without so much as turning even once to look back at me. I could tell that Clara's question took him just as off guard as it did to me, and I knew that it made us equally uncomfortable. It was a confusing and awkward subject to broach, and what made it even worse was that the children at the orphanage and Sophia didn't even know about the pregnancy yet. How would we be able to explain something like that when my belly eventually grew to the point where there was no hiding it? When we got back to the penthouse, Edric retreated to his study and shut the door. I sighed as I heard the door click shut, but kept my chin up for Ella and helped Selena and the maids prepare dinner. Ella was thankfully just too preoccupied with her exciting day to notice her father's sullenness after the question that Clara asked, but I couldn't stop thinking about it as we ate dinner and I gave Ella her bath. Would I even want to marry a man who was sleeping with other women during my pregnancy? I felt almost betrayed. Even though we weren't technically together, I felt as though I was doing my due diligence and being faithful for both Ella's and the baby's sake, despite the fact that I was just as lonely as Edric was. Meanwhile, he was having one-night stands with other women. Just because I caught him this time, too, didn't necessarily mean that there hadn't been other times. Even just thinking about it made my blood boil, however, so I tried not to let it get to me as I got Ella ready for bed. Finally, I finished Ella's bath and dried her off, then got her into her pajamas and combed out her long hair. It had become a bit of a ritual at this point for us to sit in front of her mirror at night while I brushed her hair 100 times and braided it, and just like any other night, we did just that. I expected Ella to chatter on about her exciting day, but she didn't. Much to my surprise, she was mostly quiet while I brushed and braided her hair. I figured that she was just tired, but it wasn't until I tucked her into bed for the night that she finally spoke. Moana?" she said, just as I was about to shut off the light. I stopped, turning to look at her. She was tucked into her blanket up to her chin, with her favorite stuffed animal, the little handmade stuffed duck that I'd purchased for her at the farmer's market all those weeks ago, nestled into the crook of her neck. "Yes, love?" I asked. Do you think that you and my daddy really will get married one day?" she asked. I was taken aback by her question, but I suppose that I knew it would come out eventually. Between mine and Edric's shocked silence in response to Clara's question earlier and the way that Sophia pulled her away, it was bound to have struck Ella. Not only that, but the way that her father went silent and disappeared into his study for the remainder of the night was also bound to make her uncomfortable. It was only now that I realized that she was probably mulling over the subject as well, and that was why she was so quiet all evening. Ella kept looking up at me curiously with her big doe eyes, and I finally let out a sigh and sat down on the edge of her bed. I reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair out of her eyes before I spoke. "Sometimes things just don't work out that way," I said gently. "Well, why not?" she asked. "In all of my fairy tales and princess movies, the boy and the girl always fall in love and get married and live happily ever after." I paused, biting my lip. "Real life just isn't always like your fairy tales or princess movies," I finally said after some contemplation. "But that's okay. I promise that we'll all still have our happily ever after. It'll just be a little bit different." Ella didn't answer for a minute. I watched as she scrunched up her nose, chewing and digesting what I had just told her. Of course, it broke my heart a little bit to have to tell a little girl that happily ever after wasn't always like fairy tales or princess movies. Sometimes, instead of a prince, the boy was a cold CEO who couldn't commit because of social status. And sometimes, instead of a princess, the girl was a human nanny who got herself into a rather sticky situation. But that didn't mean that we couldn't have our own happy ending in one way or another. Edric. I was passing by Ella's room when I overheard Moana and Ella talking, and my heart sank a little when I heard Ella's question. Do you think that you and my daddy really will get married one day?" she asked, no doubt because of the children at the orphanage, thinking that Moana and I were engaged. There was a long pause. I almost considered going in there and talking to Ella myself, as I wasn't quite sure how well Moana would handle it, especially after how upset she'd been that morning, but it turned out that I didn't need to. "Sometimes things just don't work out that way," Moana finally replied. Her voice was soft and gentle. "Well, why not?" Ella asked. "In all of my fairy tales and princess movies, the boy and the girl always fall in love and get married and live happily ever after." Another pause. "Real life just isn't always like your fairy tales or princess movies," Moana said after several long moments. "But that's okay. I promise that we'll all still have our happily ever after. It'll just be a little bit different." I was a bit taken aback by how well Moana handled the situation. It warmed my heart, honestly, to hear how sweetly she spoke to Ella. She could have easily said something sarcastic or backhanded because of how angry she was with me for what happened that morning. But she didn't tarnish my daughter's perception of me. Honestly, did I even deserve that? Sometimes I wondered if Ella should know that her father was not the man she thought I was. I couldn't help but wonder, either, if Ella would always feel a little bitter about my relationship with Moana, especially if she ever found out that her mother wasn't actually dead. Ella seemed satisfied by this response, and as I stood there, I saw the light flick off in the room, followed by the sound of Moana's footsteps approaching. I didn't have time to move out of the way before she opened the door and saw me standing there. "Oh," she said, her face grim and cold. "I didn't know you were here." "I was just coming to say good night," I replied. Moana nodded. "Well, she's still awake, so now's your chance." She then stepped out of my way, avoiding my gaze, and headed toward her room, but I couldn't contain my frustration any longer, and I followed her. "Actually," I said, standing behind her as she opened her bedroom door, "I'd like to talk to you." Moana froze, her hand still on the doorknob. She seemed to be unsure as to whether she wanted to speak to me or not, and I understood that, but at the same time I felt as though I had a right to explain myself. She got some seriously wrong ideas about me that morning that I needed to set straight, and she hadn't given me a chance all day to explain anything. Even though I tried to make it up to both her and Ella today, she still didn't seem satisfied. "Fine," she finally said, her voice low. She opened her door and stepped in. I followed and closed the door behind us. "What is it?" she asked as she folded her arms across her chest. I frowned, a bit annoyed still by her harsh attitude, but I decided to push my own angry thoughts down to at least try to have a civil conversation. You got some seriously wrong ideas about me this morning that I need to set straight, I said. Oh? Moana asked, raising an eyebrow. Was that your perfume, then? Or am I not allowed to ask or care, even though I'm carrying your baby in my belly? I paused, gritting my teeth. There were a few choice words that I wanted to say in response to that, but I chose to take the high road instead and took a deep breath before responding. First of all, I'm sorry that I fell asleep like that on the couch, I said. I had a drink at the bar, and then I finished off that whiskey bottle when I got home, but I was only exhausted, not drunk. I really wasn't drunk that night. Moana didn't seem to believe me, but I kept going anyway. Furthermore, I didn't sleep with anyone, I said. Why did you reek of women's perfume, then? She interrupted, her frown deepening. I watched her for a moment as she glared up at me. As I stood in front of her, even from a bit of a distance, I realized how small she was despite the air of indignant confidence she was trying to put across. She almost seemed to be unintentionally making herself smaller with her stance and her posture, as though she was recoiling into herself. I shook my head, then sighed and stared down at the floor. Admittedly, I didn't want the truth to come out now, but it had to. I almost did sleep with someone, I admitted. At the bar. I came close, but I couldn't do it. I decided against it. When I looked back up, Moana's eyes were wide. She no longer had her arms folded across her chest, and now had them hung at her sides, where she was clenching and unclenching her fists. Whether it was out of anger, frustration, hurt, or all three, I couldn't quite tell. Well, why did you decide against it? She asked. Her voice, which had been solid and even-toned before, now sounded small and almost childlike. Even in the dim light of her room, I could see that tears were beginning to form in her round green eyes. I didn't know what to say. Of course, I only did it to get my mind off of her, to try to distract myself and hopefully get over whatever strange fascination I had with her. But when I opened my mouth to say that, nothing would come out. Moana, noticing this, took in a sharp breath and narrowed her eyes. If you don't have anything else to say, then you can leave my room now, she said, pointing to the door behind me with a shaking hand. I nodded and turned back to the door. But when I put my hand on the doorknob, I couldn't bring myself to open it. It was now that the words finally came out. Maybe turning away from her, not looking her in the eye, gave me the strength to do that. I decided against it because I can't stop thinking about you, I said. Moana was silent. I still couldn't bring myself to turn around and face her, because if I did, I knew that I wouldn't be able to control myself again. Just like last night, I knew I would kiss her if I looked at her, and would probably take things even further than that, just like I secretly wanted to. I had to leave before that could happen. It would only be bad for both of us, as well as Ella and the baby, if I let it happen. Without another word, I swung the door open and walked out, hearing it shut behind me. As I stood there in the hallway, all I could think about was what I was going to do if I could no longer control myself around this strangely captivating human nanny. Moana. A few days passed after that. I had a hard time getting over what Edric said to me in my room that night, that he couldn't stop thinking about me. Was that true? Why, then, did he try to sleep with another woman? If he really couldn't stop thinking about me in the same way that I couldn't stop thinking about him, why couldn't we just admit our feelings to one another and be done with it? Even if we couldn't be public with our relationship, part of me still wanted to see if we could make it work in a private setting. Eventually, the day of the banquet came. While there was still a large part of me that just wanted to make an excuse to not go and hide in the penthouse instead, I knew that I had to be there for Ella. On the morning of the banquet, I came out of my room to find that Selena had already prepared a large breakfast for Ella and me. Ella was already sitting at the table, happily shoveling pancakes into her mouth while Selena poured my coffee for me. "Wow," I said as I approached, temporarily forgetting my anxiety about the banquet. "This is nice, Selena. Thank you." Selena nodded. "You've both got a long day ahead of you, so I wanted to make sure you have a good breakfast. Take a seat." I smiled and sat across from Ella. A plate of pancakes, bacon, and fresh fruit sat in front of me. Selena finished pouring my coffee, which I sipped gratefully before starting to dig into my breakfast. "Now," Selena said, wiping her hands on her apron and then retrieving her small date book from her apron pocket. Let's see. She opened the date book, slipping her glasses onto her nose and reading for a moment. Ella, you'll be getting your hair done at 11. And Moana, you'll have your own hair and makeup stylist coming at noon. My eyes widened just as I was about to take a bite of my pancake. I lowered the fork, furrowing my brow. That must be a mistake, I said with a chuckle. I don't have a stylist for these sorts of things. Selena only shrugged and stuffed her date book back in her pocket. Mr. Morgan booked one for you, she said. I was astonished. Edric really booked a hair and makeup stylist for me? He'd never done that before for either of the events we went to, and never even mentioned it. I couldn't help but wonder if he was just trying to butter me up by doing this. But I had to admit that there was a little part of me that secretly hoped that he was trying to doll me up because he was going to announce my pregnancy to his family at the banquet. But no, that would be ridiculous. I knew that he wouldn't be telling the rest of his family for quite a while. After all, according to him, his father could potentially do something to the baby this early on in the pregnancy. Even just the thought of it made me hold my belly protectively. Either way, I didn't put up a fuss. I finished eating, then gave Ella her bath, and got her ready for her appointment, which she wasn't particularly excited for. Ella, however, was a good girl as always, and didn't put up a fuss either, and was as polite as can be to the stylist when she finally arrived. Not long after they began to do her hair for the banquet, my own stylist arrived, an older, well-dressed man by the name of Tyrus. As he stepped out of the elevator, I was shocked by his impeccable style and perfect hair. He even wore a bit of gold eyeshadow that made his brown eyes pop out. You must be Moana, he said, walking up to me with a smile and holding out his hand. I'm Tyrus. Nice to meet you, I replied. Can I offer you some tea, Tyrus? Selena asked, seemingly already familiar with the man. Tyrus shook his head. No, thank you, Selena, he said with a smile, then looked back at me. We've got quite the afternoon ahead of us. I was still taken aback as Tyrus led me to my room, where he sat me down in front of my vanity and laid out his hair and makeup supplies. For the next 3 hours, yes, 3, Tyrus and I chatted while he trimmed and styled my hair and did my makeup. It was fascinating watching how expertly he curled and styled my hair, and how perfectly he did my makeup to give me a natural look while still having a bit of sophistication. He gave me a similar glittery gold eyeshadow to his own, which brought out the green in my eyes and the red in my hair in a way that I'd never seen before. When he was finished, I was shocked by my own reflection. Well, he asked, holding a mirror up so I could see the back of my hair. What do you think? I shook my head in disbelief as I ran my hands over my incredibly soft hair and leaned forward in my seat to look at the impeccable makeup he did. It's beautiful. A tiny voice suddenly called from the doorway. Tyrus and I both looked up to see Ella standing there with her hair done as well and a big grin on her face. She ran up to me and bounced up and down excitedly on her toes. You look so pretty, Moana. I couldn't help but blush at Ella's reaction, and Tyrus chuckled as he packed up his supplies. Really, I said as I walked him back to the elevator a few minutes later, you did a great job. Thank you so much. Oh, it's nothing, Tyrus replied with a warm smile. A friend of Edric's is a friend of mine. You know Edric well? I asked. Tyrus shrugged. We knew each other in college, he said, before I came out to my parents and decided to run off and enroll in cosmetology school. If you can believe it, I was a business major back then. Yuck. I laughed as I pictured a younger Tyrus and a younger Edric being acquaintances in college. In fact, as I said goodbye to Tyrus and watched the elevator doors close, I couldn't stop imagining what Edric was like in college. To think of him as a bright-eyed young man with big dreams for the future made me smile. But at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder if going to school to become the next WearCorp CEO was his own dream, or if it was his father's dream. That evening, Selena helped Ella get ready for the banquet, while Amy and Lily helped me. I wore the silk dress that Edric picked out for me at the mall, and although it felt a little dirty now knowing that he almost slept with another woman on the same day that he bought it for me, I couldn't help but feel beautiful as I looked in the mirror. Even Amy and Lily couldn't stop fawning over the quality of the dress and kept feeling the fabric between their fingers. I promised that they could try the new dresses on in my room sometime, just for fun, and they seemed excited by that idea. When I was finished, I finally stepped out of my room and into the living room where Edric was waiting. I felt almost like the lady of the house, and when Edric's eyes slid over me and his face almost went a little pale, I temporarily forgot that I really was just the nanny. Ella came out along with me and took my hand, grinning up at me. "Well, Daddy," she asked, twirling around to show off her skirt. "How do we look?" The alpha billionaire smiled a warm, sweet smile. "There's my favorite girls," he said. "Edric." "There's my favorite girls," I said with a smile. I didn't even think about it before I said it, but I knew as soon as it came out of my mouth that I'd made a mistake. Ella didn't seem to notice, but Moana sure did. Her green eyes, which looked even more beautiful with the small amount of gold eyeshadow around them, widened. "Ha!" I said, feigning surprise at myself in the feeble hope that I could get away without Moana dwelling on this too much. "Slip of the tongue. Are you two ready?" When we arrived at the banquet, the party had already begun. The end of summer banquet was a long-standing Morgan family tradition. The banquet that I had taken Moana and Ella to earlier that summer was solely for more immediate family and close friends. But this banquet was different. Each summer, practically every single member of the entire Morgan clan, from immediate family to cousins several times removed, and all of their own friends and extended families through marriage would come from all over the globe to visit my parents' mansion. Needless to say, these parties were huge and often went on for 2 or 3 days. That was why I paid my old friend Tyrus to come and do Moana's hair and makeup. Sure, it was necessary for the nanny, but I wanted to make a good impression. Besides, I had to admit that I wanted to do a little something nice for Moana to make her feel better, although I would never tell her that. The driver pulled up to the front driveway and we got out. Moana held Ella's hand as we walked up the wide stone pathway, lined with fountains and sculptures, but as soon as Ella saw her other little cousins, she instantly took off running. "Oh, Ella," Moana called, taken by surprise by Ella's sudden mad dash. "It's all right," I said with a chuckle. "She only gets to see these kids once a year. She'll be fine, although that dress will probably wind up in the trash by the time she's done rolling around with them like an animal." Moana managed a wry laugh and followed me up the steps to the front door, where servants were waiting to take our jackets. Glasses of champagne were handed to us almost as soon as we walked into the large banquet hall, but Moana refused. "Darling," my mother's familiar voice called as I entered. She waved at us from across the crowd, and Moana and I made our way over to her. Of course, with so many people here, she only extended Moana the basic pleasantries, although I knew that my mother secretly wanted to dote on the mother of my second child all night. When I was with Olivia, it was the same thing. I didn't have to hide my relationship with Olivia quite as much as with Moana, so my mother would spend hours at these events gushing over her, despite my father's sullenness that I wasn't married to her. Although Olivia quickly stopped even coming to the events as soon as she got pregnant. I didn't realize it at the time, thinking that she was just dealing with morning sickness throughout the pregnancy, but she was really sneaking around with other men and only used the pregnancy to keep me faithful. "How are you, Mom?" I asked, planting a kiss on her cheek while Moana stood nearby, looking a little out of place despite her luxurious outfit. "I'm splendid," my mother said, then turned to Moana. "And you look absolutely stunning, dear. You're glowing." Moana blushed. "Thank you." Then my mother turned back to face me and lowered her voice. "I'd advise steering clear of your father, at least until he's had a couple of drinks in him," she said, patting my hand. "He's not happy about the tabloid." My eyes widened, so my father did see the tabloid after all. When he didn't call to scold me about it, I thought that he never saw it. "Does he know?" I asked, indicating Moana's pregnancy. "I think he might have an idea," my mother replied. "But I told him that we were just having a nice lunch and that you never mentioned anything about a pregnancy. That might have allayed his suspicions for the time being." "Good. I felt a lump rise in my throat as I scanned the crowd for my father, but when I finally spotted him, he was far on the other side of the banquet hall and appeared to be deep in conversation with one of my uncles. Suddenly, I felt someone tap my shoulder. I turned around to see none other than Kelly grinning up at me. She really seemed to go all out for this banquet with her hair and makeup, but what most struck me was that she was wearing an eerily similar dress to the one that Moana was wearing. In fact, the longer I looked at it, the more I realized that it was in fact the exact same dress, just tighter, as though she had it altered to sit snugly around her waist and show off her flat stomach. I couldn't help but wonder if it was intentional, as if she was trying to one-up Moana, who had to hide her belly somewhat. I personally found Kelly to pale in comparison to how beautiful Moana looked. "Hello, dear Edric," Kelly said, planting a wet kiss on my cheek. "It's been a little while, hasn't it?" "Since the gala, yes," I said. "Thank you again for that generous donation." Kelly pursed her lips and glanced over at Moana, who had still hardly said a word this entire time. Kelly's eyes slid up and down Moana judgingly before coming back to me. "Well, it was the least I could do to help you get a head start," Kelly finally said. "Of course, if it were a werewolf orphanage, I could have donated more. But I didn't want to be making too much of a political statement." I stifled a scoff. Of course, Kelly would say that. She had always been anti-humans, at least since we were teenagers. I always found it funny because of the fact that we often played with the human servant children when we were little, and she didn't seem to have a problem then. But then again, I suppose that it was bound to happen eventually, being raised by a wealthy werewolf family. Even I still had my hang-ups about humans, although I had to admit that Moana was slowly breaking those walls down. "Anyway," Kelly said, "I'm glad I found you. Can we talk?" "I only need a minute of your time." "Sure," I replied, only to be polite. I followed Kelly across the banquet hall, taking one last glance over my shoulder at Moana. She stared after us with a combination of abandonment and jealousy on her face, and it admittedly made me feel a little bad. Kelly eventually pushed through one of the doors that led to a small garden outside. Once we were outside and alone, she stopped on the steps and turned to face me. "I have a proposition," she said, a coy smile spreading across her face. I frowned. "What is it?" "Well, everyone saw that tabloid, Now, I'm not saying that what was on the cover of that tabloid is necessarily true, although I think the nanny's added weight says it all anyway. But you know that people are bound to start asking questions. And, well, say that the tabloid was right and you did have something to hide. I could help you hide it." "Oh?" I asked, raising an eyebrow as I folded my arms across my chest. Kelly grinned. "Yes, I think you need a public wife, so to speak, preferably an alpha from a good family." I couldn't help but roll my eyes. "And I suppose you expect that to be you," I replied. Kelly didn't seem fazed. "I mean, it could be anyone," she said. "It's not like it would be real, only real to the public. This wife could also claim Ella as her daughter, so not only could you be free of speculation, but you also wouldn't have to hide Ella as much anymore. I think it's a win for everybody." I didn't know what to say. I was completely taken aback by this preposterous idea of Kelly's, and it made me wonder deep down if she somehow orchestrated this. She was so infatuated with me that I wouldn't put it past her to be the anonymous donor who tried to pay the tabloid to keep the picture up, just to cause an uproar and give me no choice but to go through with this fake relationship. Before I could say anything, however, Kelly spoke again. She moved closer to me, as she did, and her eyes narrowed seductively. "Think of it this way," she said. "If I came out as your alpha wife and Ella's alpha mother, then no one would bother you about the nanny anymore, because no one would ever accuse the CEO of WereCorp of being unfaithful to his wife with a lowly human servant. Right?" Moana. As I watched Edric and Kelly walk away together, I couldn't help but feel a little jealous. Not only that, but she was wearing the exact same dress as I was. Even Verona did a double take when she saw Kelly walk up to us. When they were gone, Verona quickly came over to me and took my hand. "Don't worry about it, dear," she said gently, giving my hand a squeeze. "Kelly? Well, she's not a bad girl, really, but she's always had a bit of an infatuation with Edric. She'll get bored eventually and stop pestering you." "It's all right," I replied with a smile, even though I couldn't help but feel bad. It's just a dress. Verona gave me a sad look. I felt as though I would cry and ruin my makeup if I kept standing here. So I quickly excused myself under the guise of performing my job duties as a nanny and went to look for Ella. After several minutes of walking around and weaving my way through the growing crowd, I finally spotted Ella over by the snack bar with her friends. As children often do, they were stuffing their cheeks with sweets. Ahem. I cleared my throat as I came up to Ella, folding my arms across my chest and looking down at her. The other kids saw me and quickly ran away, but she slowly turned to face me and gave me a sheepish smile, her cheeks round with cream puff pastries. "You'll spoil your appetite, young lady," I said, stifling a laugh at the little girl's chipmunk-like appearance. She chewed for a minute, then finally swallowed with a big gulp. "Sorry," she muttered, staring down at the floor. "I was hungry." "Well, at least get a plate and sit down when you eat," I said gently, taking her hand as I began to lead her away from the snacks. "It's not very polite to eat like that." I led Ella back to Verona, who was still waiting by her table as she talked to a servant, seemingly giving orders, judging from the way that she pointed and gestured at various tables. The servant nodded understandingly before scurrying off. Verona let out a sigh, then finally noticed Ella coming, and a wide smile spread across her face. Ella ran up to her, grinning from ear to ear as her grandmother showered her with kisses. I hadn't even fully caught up yet when I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder. At first, I thought it was Edric needing something from me. But when I turned around, I felt myself go pale as a sheet when I saw that it wasn't in fact Edric, but was instead his father, Michael. He was staring down at me with a terse smile spread across his face, but his eyes were cold and stern. "Care for a dance?" he said, holding out his hand. I stuttered, my heart practically pounding out of my chest as a million thoughts raced through my mind. Why was Michael Morgan asking me to dance, if not to confront me about the pregnancy? Even if it wasn't about the pregnancy, it certainly had something to do with my relationship with his son. I was sure of it. "Well, is that a yes or a no?" he asked. "Come along. I like this song. I'd like to dance before it ends." Before I could resist, Michael's hand dug into my shoulder, and he guided me somewhat roughly over to the dance floor. He then turned to face me and took one of my hands in his, then put his other hand on my waist. I could feel my own hands trembling as I placed my free hand on his shoulder. Thank you," I managed to squeak out, forcing a tense smile as we began to dance to the music. Michael was a stern leader, and I almost felt as though I was being thrown around a bit as we danced. "This is a lovely song." For a few moments, we danced in silence. He smelled like an almost sickly combination of whiskey, cigar smoke, and cologne. It made me want to gag and started to trigger my morning sickness, but I somehow managed to keep my cool in front of him. "I suppose I'll cut right to the chase," he finally said after a couple of minutes, a tense smile still spread across his face while his eyes scanned the crowd around us, doing anything but looking at me. "How much will it cost to make you go away?" I stopped in my tracks, but Michael hardly seemed to notice and kept pulling me along as we danced, nearly causing me to stumble. I didn't know what to say. What did he mean? Why was he doing this? Why now, especially, right in the middle of a huge party? Pardon me?" I asked, swallowing the lump in my throat. Michael scoffed. "I know you're pregnant with my son's child," he said, lowering his voice. The way that the smile stayed plastered on his face, as though we were just having a casual conversation, made me sick. If I reacted, not only would it make a scene in front of so many people, many of whom were looking at us, wondering why Michael Morgan was dancing with a human, but it would also appear as though I was acting erratically if he appeared so calm and cordial. No one could see the way that his fingers dug into my skin. It was now, for the first time in the past couple of days, that Mina suddenly began to appear. I quickly pushed her down, knowing that she would try to encourage me to do something rash, and I was afraid that Michael would do something to my baby. I'm not looking for money," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want anything." Michael let out a wry chuckle. He dipped me with a bit of force, then pulled me back up, making my head spin. To everyone else, it just looked like an elaborate dance, but to me, it was a deliberate act of violence. I won't have my family name sullied by yet another illegitimate child, he said. Ella is bad enough as it is, to add not only another child, but a human child at that. He skied. I won't have it. Name your price and leave my family alone. I'm not trying to sully your family's name, I replied. Mina wouldn't be quelled, and I felt her anger bubbling up inside of me. Tell him, she growled. Tell him you're a werewolf. That'll shut him up. I shook my head slightly, ignoring her. I only met your son because he offered me a job. That was a lie to an extent, but I didn't care. I would say anything to get away from Michael now before he hurt my baby. A job? He laughed. What about the expensive clothes? The penthouse? The fancy dinners and professional stylists? Were those part of the job description? The lump in my throat grew bigger. I didn't have an answer for that. Of course, those things weren't part of the job description, but I also insisted every step of the way that Edric didn't need to spoil me like that. It was his decision to do those things, not mine. I only got pregnant by accident. Before I could answer, however, the song finally came to an end. Much to my surprise, Michael stepped back and bowed. Curtsy, he snarled. My eyes widened. What? Michael glanced up, glaring at me. Curtsy, you whore. I wanted to scream, but I did as he said and curtsied to end our dance. The people around us, entirely oblivious to the situation, clapped enthusiastically. Michael stood, straightening his jacket. As the crowd filled in once more, the smile on his face faded and was replaced with a distinct look of disgust. I'll give you until the end of the night to decide, he said. Take the money or don't. Either way, I won't allow you to continue seeing my son. Moana. I was so utterly, unbelievably stunned by Michael's cruel proposition and his rough mannerisms during our dance that I was frozen to my spot. Even as he walked away and disappeared into the crowd, I still felt as though my heart would beat straight out of my chest. I could already feel the vomit bubbling up in my throat from the fear, which was the only thing that got me moving. I quickly ran to the bathroom, which was thankfully empty. Tears welled up in my eyes as I burst into one of the stalls and doubled over. Nothing came up, thankfully. I gagged a bit, but that was it. So I took a deep breath and walked over to the sink to splash some cold water on my neck and try to calm down. Surely, Michael's threat meant nothing. Edric would certainly handle this. I didn't need to worry. I would tell him after the banquet so as not to ruin his fun, and for now, I would just try to have some fun of my own and not think about what Michael said. I just needed some fresh air, and then everything would be better. Taking another deep breath, I stepped out of the bathroom and followed the hallway until I came to a door that led out to the courtyard, the same one that I had danced in with Ethan at the first banquet. The air was hot, but there was a bit of a breeze. I made my way over to the fountain and sat down, letting the cool spray hit my back as I sat and tried not to cry. Everything okay? A familiar voice said. I lifted my head to see Ethan standing in front of me. He had his hands in his pockets and was looking down at me with a concerned look on his face. Everything's fine, I said, managing a weak smile, but as soon as I met Ethan's soft gaze, I couldn't hide it. My eyes started to fill with tears and my face twisted into a grimace. I covered my face with my hands, not wanting to let Ethan see me cry. I'm sorry, I muttered into my hands. It's really nothing. Just then I felt a pair of warm arms slide around me. I slowly looked up to see Ethan gazing at me with worry drawn across his face. You can tell me, he said gently, reaching up to tuck a strand of loose hair behind my ear. It's okay. I sighed, staring down at my lap, and shook my head. It's just Michael, I whispered, biting my lip for a moment. He tried to give me money to make me go away, and he called me a whore. Ethan's face twisted into a scowl. I could feel his arms tense around me. That bastard, he said, shaking his head. Do you need me to talk to him? I shook my head vehemently. The last thing I wanted was for Ethan to confront Michael. It would only make things worse. Even Edric would be upset that I confided something like this in Ethan. Edric didn't even know that I told Ethan about the pregnancy. There was a long silence. My chest quaked a bit with stifled sobs. but Ethan held me firmly and rubbed my back. It was comforting to have a friend here at a time like this. If I told Edric now, I knew that he would instantly go to his father and cause a scene, but I just needed some comfort and someone to confide in. I was glad to have Ethan as a friend. "Moana?" Ethan's voice was soft. I looked up to see him gazing at me in a way that reminded me of the night that we danced out here, when we almost kissed. Except this time he did kiss me. He kissed me gently on the lips. His lips were warm and soft, but I didn't have an interest in him like that. I thought that we had an understanding about that when he first mentioned his feelings for me when we went out for dinner. I froze for a moment, shocked and confused, before pulling away with wide eyes. "What are you doing?" I asked, recoiling and wriggling free of his embrace. I stood, smoothing down my dress. "You know that's not what I want." Ethan frowned and stood, taking my hands in his, as his eyes searched my face earnestly. "Moana, I can't deny how I feel about you," he said. "And I think there's a part of you that feels the same way. I can sense it. You know I can treat you and the baby so much better than Edric does. If we were together, there would be no question about it. I would proudly take you as my wife. I would never hide you from the public." I quickly pulled my hands away and shook my head. "No, Ethan," I said, taking a step back. "I don't want that. You know I don't." "Moana, please, I care about you." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was stare back at Ethan and blink incredulously, my eyes wide. I thought that we agreed that we would just be friends, but clearly he didn't seem to think that I was serious when I told him the first time. Ethan stared at me for a few moments before suddenly turning and walking away without so much as a goodbye. I watched after him, watching as he disappeared in the direction of his studio. I was alone again. More tears came, and I sat back down on the edge of the fountain. Now, more than ever, I felt alone in the world because I didn't even have a friend I could trust. It seemed that men only ever wanted to use me throughout my entire life. First, my boyfriend Sam only used me for emotional support before leaving me for a model and a fancy job at WorkCorp. Then, Edric only had a one-night stand with me and only saw me as the lowly human nanny, no matter how hard I tried. And now this. Not to mention Michael, trying to throw money at me to make me disappear. Was I really not worth anyone's true love and affection? I sat there for a while, not wanting to go back inside as I dabbed at my tears with a handkerchief. Part of me really began to wonder if I should have just taken Michael's money and left. At least then, I could be free of all of this extra pain. With that money, maybe I could just raise my baby in peace. I could even start over fresh in a new city if I really wanted to. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave Ella behind, and I couldn't deny the fact that I didn't want to leave Edric behind either. Suddenly, as I sat there staring into the fountain in deep contemplation, I heard the sound of heels approaching on stone. I looked up, and my heart dropped. Kelly was headed my way. Edric. I was too taken aback by Kelly's proposition to even speak. Was she the one who paid off the tabloid to keep the photo up just so she could manipulate me into having a fake relationship with her? Or did someone else put her up to it? Like my father? "Well," she said, batting her eyelashes in front of me. "What do you say?" I paused, blinking incredulously as my head reeled. "I need a drink." Without another word, I turned on my heel and headed back toward the door to the banquet hall. "At least think about it," Kelly called after me in a sing-song tone of voice. "I'll be waiting to hear your decision." I sighed as I stepped back into the banquet hall, letting the music and the noise of the guests wash over me. Why couldn't I just enjoy the banquet? Why did it seem as though these sorts of things always had some sort of political connotations behind them? As I headed over to the bar, I tried to push my conversation with Kelly into the back of my mind. She was already a little drunk, and was clearly just being vindictive because she still couldn't seem to get over the fact that I was never going to be interested in her romantically. "Gin and tonic, please," I told the bartender. I turned around and looked across the room at the party guests as I waited for my drink, and as I did, I saw a familiar head making its way toward me through the crowd. My father. Great. "Hello, Dad," I said as he approached. I stuck my hand out, but he didn't shake it and instead brushed past me to order his drink. So it was going to be one of those nights. My mother really wasn't lying when she said he was in a mood. With a stifled sigh, I turned back around and took my drink from the bartender. I was sipping it and minding my own business when my father suddenly slapped a folded piece of paper down in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, furrowing my brow as I picked it up and opened it. My eyes widened as I saw that it was a chart depicting our stock prices. They seemed to have gone down a little over the past week. It was correlated perfectly with the day that the tabloid incident occurred. "Your little mistake is already taking an effect on our business," my father said. He tilted his head back and drank his small glass of whiskey in one go, then slammed the cup back down on the bar with an amount of force that even made the poor bartender jump. "You need to do what's best for our company. This has gone on for long enough." "What's best?" I asked, folding the paper back up and sliding it over to him. "What are you talking about? What has gone on for long enough?" My father let out an exasperated sound that was mere centimeters away from a growl. The bartender refilled his glass, and he snatched it away and drank that in one go as well. "I may be old, but I'm not a fool, boy," my father said. "I was patient enough with your first child. She may be illegitimate, but at least she's a purebred werewolf. But this—" He turned, gesturing toward Moana as she walked across the ballroom holding Ella's hand. I watched as Ella excitedly took off toward my mother, who was grinning from ear to ear and showering her with kisses. My father never even once smiled at Ella. My eyes wandered over to Moana then, who looked absolutely stunning in her dress, far better than Kelly looked, and Moana hardly even had to try to look that beautiful. She was a natural beauty, whereas Kelly was too thin, and the effects of too much alcohol, too many cigarettes, and not eating enough were already starting to show on her face. I always suspected that she dabbled in other drugs too, but I could never be sure. "Dad, do we need to have this conversation right now?" I asked, taking my glass and taking a step away from the bar. "It's the family banquet. Why can't you just have a nice time?" My father scoffed. "How can I seriously have a nice time when you're running around impregnating human nannies?" A lump rose in my throat at my father's words. For the second time that night, I was reminded that Moana was just that, a human nanny, a servant from a lower class. I often forgot that she wasn't a werewolf socialite because of her beauty and her grace, which made it hurt even more when I was reminded of her true social standing. Of course, I couldn't admit it to anyone, and not even really to myself, but I secretly wished that she was a werewolf socialite. If she was, I might have reconsidered our relationship by now if it weren't for my overwhelming disdain for love and marriage. I didn't know what to say. My father turned then to gesture toward Kelly, who had just walked in through the side door and was now sauntering across the banquet hall. "Why don't you just marry Kelly already?" he said. "She's a werewolf from a well-to-do family, and she's an alpha. You could say that Ella is the daughter that you had with her, and no one will bat an eye." I could think of one person who would certainly bat an eye, though: Ella's mother, Olivia. It was already difficult enough as it was to keep Ella in the dark on the true nature of her mother, and to keep her believing that her mother was dead. If I told the public that Ella was Kelly's daughter, Olivia would find out and would do everything in her power to meddle in one way or another. Not only that, but Ella would resent me forever if she found out. I had always planned on maybe speaking to Ella about it one day when she was grown up and could emotionally understand my reasons behind doing it, but if she found out now at such a young age, I wasn't sure if she would ever get over it. Suddenly, I came to the realization that my father must have been the one to put Kelly up to talking to me. They were certainly in cahoots together, and it made my blood boil. "You put her up to it, didn't you?" I asked, spinning around to face him as I gripped my glass with so much force that I was certain it would break. "You told Kelly to try to convince me to have a fake relationship with her." My father only shrugged and took his third drink off of the bar, this time holding it nonchalantly as he began to make his way toward the dance floor. "It's time for you to grow up, Edric," he said. "It's time to do what's best for the company." I stared after him as he disappeared into the crowd without another word. I still hadn't even finished my drink, and by now I didn't even want it. I just needed to get out and get some fresh air. Leaving my drink on the bar, I turned and stormed off toward the garden. I needed to take a walk and get away from all of this. Moana. I was still staring into the fountain, utterly taken aback by Ethan's sudden decision to kiss me when I just needed a friend to confide in, when I suddenly heard the sound of heels clicking across stone. My heart dropped when I looked up and saw who was headed straight for me. Kelly. She had a devious smirk on her face that told me everything I needed to know. She was up to something. I would have tried to get up and walk away, but she clearly saw me already, and it was too late. "Hey, Kelly," I said, forcing a faint smile. "How are you?" I tried to be polite and ignore the fact that she was clearly wearing the exact same dress as I was, even though it made me uncomfortable to see her like that. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just a coincidence, as the store that Edric took me to did seem expensive and popular, but I knew Kelly just enough to sense that it was completely intentional on her part. She clearly even had the dress altered to sit more tightly on her abdomen, as though she was trying to flaunt the fact that her belly was flat and slim, while mine was growing. Kelly stopped in front of me with that same smirk on her face. She had her phone in her hand and was gripping it so tightly that her knuckles were right. Now that she was up close, I could tell that there was something else behind her smirk. Pure evil and hatred. Her eyes were cold and calculating. "You know," she said, putting her hands on her hips, "I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. I mean, it's obvious that you're only trying to scam poor Edric into giving you money and social status, and he's falling for it for some stupid reason. But I thought, hey, maybe she is just a nanny looking for work. Turns out, I was wrong, and everyone can see it. Edric will see it too after tonight." What?" I asked, blinking incredulously. "I'm not sure if I know what you're talking about." Kelly scoffed. She still stood in front of me, effectively blocking anyone from seeing me. I couldn't help but wonder if it was intentional, as though she didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do to me. "You're such a slut, seducing two brothers like that in one night." My eyes widened. Did she see my kiss with Ethan? Anyone on the outside could have been able to tell that that kiss was spontaneous and not consensual. "Kelly, that's not what—" "Oh, save your excuses," she said, tapping on her phone now to unlock it. "I saw you. And I have proof." "Proof? Here." She tapped some more on her screen and then turned it around so I could see. My eyes widened as she did. On the screen, there was a clear picture of Ethan kissing me on the fountain. It was right before I came to my senses and pushed him away, which made it appear as though I liked it. As though I wanted him to kiss me, even though I didn't really want him to at all. "Ethan kissed me without my permission, and I rejected him," I snarled, standing. "You're twisting the narrative." "I'm twisting the narrative," Kelly responded with a wry chuckle. "You're the one who's been waltzing around with Edric, weaseling your way into his life and his family's life. Everyone knows what you've been up to, and it's pathetic. Why can't you just take Michael's money and leave all of us alone?" A pit formed in my stomach. Kelly knew about Michael's ultimatum? Were they in on it together? Or something? All along, Kelly had been following Edric around like a lost puppy, and his father had apparently been pushing it for years. I couldn't help but wonder if they planned on working together tonight to push Edric and I apart and make me go away. Was that why Kelly wanted to speak to Edric privately at the beginning of the banquet? "I think you're just jealous," I blurted out. So Kelly's eyes widened. "Jealous?" she asked, laughing abrasively. "Me? Jealous of you? That's ridiculous. I would never be jealous of a worthless human nanny who had to go and get herself knocked up by a wealthy werewolf CEO in a pathetic attempt to climb the social ranks." Now I was the one who laughed. I felt Mina bubbling up again inside of me, urging me to stand up for myself. And I did just that. Mina's presence instilled me with newfound confidence, and suddenly I didn't care what anyone would think if they overheard me. To me, Kelly was nothing but a sullen teenager. "You are jealous," I said. "You're jealous that Edric will never want you. You think that he'll choose a human nanny over you, and you can't stand that. You're like a child." Kelly's eyes widened so far that I could see the whites all around her pupils. Her face went beet red, and even the veins on her neck began to pop out. "You little bitch," she snarled. Then, in one swift movement, she raised her hand, pulled it back, and slapped me across the face as hard as she could. There was a flash of light, just from the force of being struck by a werewolf. It made my head reel, and I fell back onto the edge of the fountain, clutching my face. "I'm showing Edric this photo tonight," Kelly said nonchalantly, as she stuck her phone back in her purse, while I was still sitting on the edge of the fountain and clutching my face. I left staring dazedly down at the ground. "Either take Michael's money and leave us all alone once and for all, or I'll make sure Edric kicks you out himself." I couldn't speak. The pain from the slap was still throbbing through my face and my head, making my ears ring so much that I could hardly even hear Kelly's voice. Finally, seemingly satisfied with her destruction, she flicked her long, blonde hair over her shoulder with a humph and stormed off. The last thing I heard after the fading sound of her heels clicking away on the cobblestone ground was the sound of the door opening and closing, temporarily letting the music and voices carry across the small garden air before disappearing again. Once I was alone, a sob escaped my throat. I lowered my shaking hand from my stinging face, my entire body shaking with pain and rage. No matter whether I took Michael's bribe and left or didn't take it, I was still stuck between a rock and a hard place. Would Edric really kick me out over a kiss that I didn't even want? Would my child always wonder why his or her father didn't want to be in our lives? Would Ella always wonder why I left her? The tears started to flow now, and I knew that I would be seen easily here, and people would begin to start asking questions. So, gathering what little dignity I had left, I stood and began to make my way further away from the banquet hall, where I could be truly alone with my pain, Moana. With my face still burning from Kelly's slap, I needed to get away from the banquet before anyone saw me and started gossiping even more. If anyone saw me crying, I knew that Kelly would be satisfied as well, and I didn't want that. As I gathered what little dignity I had left and started making my way through the gardens, the sound of the music and the partygoers talking and laughing slowly began to fade, replaced by the sound of the crickets chirping and the sound of the fountains. I eventually found a quiet garden not too far away, with a fountain in the center and rows of peach trees circling the perimeter, their sweet fragrance filling the air. I leaned against one of these trees and bowed my head, finally letting the tears flow now that I knew I was completely alone. All my life, I only ever wanted to create a beautiful family of my own. After spending my childhood in an orphanage, I always wanted to bring a child into the world with two loving parents who would never leave. The thought of having a big, happy family always made me smile, but now it only made me cry more as I realized that even my own child might never have that now. Even if Edric did accept this child, he would never accept me, and his family would never accept either of us. How could I bring a child into a mess like this? How could I bring a child into a world in which his or her own grandfather hated them with a burning passion? As I thought about the possibility of packing up and leaving, even with Michael's money, it made me sob even more. It wasn't even just about Edric or the baby either. Ella had become almost like my own child in my eyes, and I couldn't bear the thought of her confused, sad little face wondering why I was leaving. But no matter what, one way or another, someone would sow the seeds of hatred in her mind at some point. Whether it was disdain for the new baby, thinking that it would replace her, or whether it was disdain for me and ruining her family structure, I couldn't imagine a scenario in which someone wouldn't eventually give her the wrong ideas and create bitterness in her heart. "Are you all right?" I didn't hear him coming as I cried. I jerked my head up and whirled around to see Edric standing behind me with his hands in his pockets and a concerned look spread across his face. Yes," I said, straightening myself and wiping the tears from my eyes with my handkerchief. "Just hormones. I got a little overwhelmed with all of the noise and the people." Edric didn't seem to believe me, but he didn't pry. Neither of us spoke for a few moments. As he glanced over his shoulder at the mansion, the sounds of the party carrying over to us across the summer breeze, a small sigh escaped his lips. I couldn't help but wonder if something had happened to him, too. Maybe Kelly and his father pestered him in a similar way. It's a nice party, I said, just wanting to change the subject. Edric shrugged. Normally, yes. This year. His voice faltered and he swallowed hard. Want to walk? I nodded. Yes. Walking would be nice. We started to walk together, neither of us speaking. I held my purse in my hands while Edric kept his own hands in his pockets, but there was no denying the closeness behind us as we walked. Neither of us spoke, but I enjoyed the silence. It was nice, after my interactions with both Ethan and Kelly, to just walk quietly with someone who seemed to have a similar understanding of what I was going through. I forgot sometimes that this pregnancy was affecting Edric in a similar way. Sometimes I suppose that I got so caught up in my own feelings about it that I forgot what it meant for him to have a child with a woman he only just met, and to have feelings for that woman when it was socially unacceptable for him to act on them. It must have taken a great toll on him. We passed through a stone colonnade that led to another, bigger garden. Up ahead, there was a large fountain surrounded by white stone and red rose bushes. There was a small, ornate stone bench at the front of the fountain, and it called to me. After everything that happened, especially with the heat of the summer evening, my feet were beginning to ache and swell in my heels. I tried to pick shoes with low heels, but the pregnancy was making even those feel uncomfortable. Is it okay if we sit? I asked, gesturing to the bench and looking over at Edric. My face quickly went red as I did, seeing how handsome he looked in the dim light with the breeze ruffling his hair. I quickly looked away, swallowing. My feet hurt a bit. Edric nodded. We approached the bench and he gestured for me to sit, but he continued to stand, thoughtfully inspecting the roses on one of the bushes. I watched in silence as he touched the petals with his fingers, as though he was counting each one. It must have been nice, growing up here with all of these gardens, I said, looking around. It's so lush. It was one of the better parts of living here, he said quietly. Plenty of places to escape to when my father was in a mood. He rarely bothered coming out this far, so sometimes when his moods were especially sour, I would even sleep out here under the stars. I couldn't help but feel bad, imagining little Edric sleeping outside when his father was being cruel or moody. But when I looked up at him, I saw that there was a bit of a smile twitching at the corners of his lips. He didn't seem too upset by it. If anything, he seemed to be remembering those days fondly. I realized now that maybe those days were preferable to these ones, before he grew up and became a CEO. It also reminded me of what Tyrus had told me earlier that day, and I couldn't contain my curiosity. Tyrus told me that you went to college together, I said. What was college like for you? What did you go for? Edric shrugged, walking now over to the next rosebush. Business. Nothing exciting. I paused, biting my lip. College was supposed to be an exciting time, a time for exploring the things that make you happy and choosing a career path that brings you joy. Edric, however, didn't seem too fond of that time at all. What else would you have studied? I asked. When you were little, I'm sure you didn't say you wanted to grow up to be a businessman. The alpha billionaire, much to my surprise, let out a chuckle. No, I suppose not, he said, his eyes lifting finally from the roses to look up at the moon. It's embarrassing, though. Everyone has embarrassing dreams when they're kids, I insisted. You can tell me. Edric was silent for a few moments. Then, with a sigh, he finally answered. His voice sounded almost choked. I wanted to be a teacher, he finally admitted. A music teacher. My heart skipped at this thought, but at the same time I felt confused. I had never seen Edric play any sort of instrument or even mention an interest in music. Do you play any instruments? I asked. He nodded. Piano, mostly. That was strange. There was a piano in the penthouse, which Ella only used for her lessons. Other than Ella, I may have heard Amy or Lily plunk on it once in a while, but Edric never even looked at it. I opened my mouth to ask why, but suddenly, before I could say anything, the alpha billionaire did something even more unexpected. He kicked off his shoes, peeled off his socks, and rolled up his pants. What are you doing? I asked, stifling a chuckle as he climbed up on the bench. You said your feet hurt, he said, stepping over the back of the bench and straight into the fountain. Come on. I stood, shooting Edric a confused look. He seemed entirely sober. I hadn't seen a drink in his hand all night, and yet here he was, standing barefoot in the fountain out behind his parents' mansion, and he was holding his hand out for me with an earnest look on his face. "The water feels nice," he said, "I promise."